So, this is our first installment in our White American History series, and we're very excited to bring this to you. A lot of us have done quite a lot of research in the last weeks, and of course, we're bringing a lifetime of interest in the history of our people to the table. The scope of today's discussion is quite broad, and there's no way that we can cover exhaustively everything that's under the ambit of this topic, which is simply everything in European history prior to Jamestown. But we can give a good idea of how exactly Europe came to be situated in such a way that we were able to settle the New World and found the kind of country that ultimately we did. So we'll be doing these in installments. Future episodes will be considerably more detailed and topic specific. This is kind of a broad intro to get everyone up to speed. We will do these either bi-weekly or possibly monthly, depending on scheduling. And if you'd like to be involved yourself, you can reach out to me on Telegram at Arvel or DM me here on X, and we can interview you or audition you to be a member of the panel. So to start with, let's introduce our panelists here. So first of all, James.
My name is James Johnson. Been involved with right-wing white nationalist politics for better part of a decade now. In real life for about 5 years. History-wise, just sort of a student of history, generally speaking. Love reading about it, love experiencing it. I have some ties to foundational ancestors for the New World that I'll be talking about here a little bit later. Otherwise, you can reach me on X or on Gab. Both locations are ATG_SD. So that's Alpha Thomas Gamma _ Sierra Delta. And that's on X as well on Gab. Thank you.
All right. Jim?
Yeah, I'm Jim Dewey. For those of you that care about the credential, I do have a postgraduate study in the sphere of history, a couple of minor publications under my own name, but more salient to the discussion at hand, I have run for a couple of years now a small dissident right-wing YouTube channel, Combating the Narrative, Jim Dewey. You can find me that way. Primarily history-based, though there is a little current events on that channel, or a little in the way of current events. You can find me on X, Twitter, at Combating Ends.
All right, thank you. J-Play.
Yeah, I'm J-Play. My name is John Marshall, and just a student of history. I have a bachelor's degree in history from Florida State University, and it's a pleasure to be on the program. I'm no one special, but I'm known as J-Play based on X or Twitter, depending on how you call it, and ready to have a good time.
All right, awesome. Luke.
Hey, I am Luke Corbett. I only recently stepped into the political public realm. I'm the author of American Precipice, currently finishing up Heir to the Throne, which will be a huge expose on J.D. Vance. I'm a historian. I have a degree in poli-sci. I'm a political analyst. I'm an American, a Catholic. I'm a reactionary, and I'm what you could politically classify as far right or dissonant. You can find me on X and everything else at Luke A. Corbett. Same username on everything.
All right. Luther?
Hi, folks. So I'm a Mayflower American. Nobody special again here in particular, just passionate about history and looking to learn more. I'm a homeschooling father, so I'm hoping to learn quite a bit here myself and just see what we can do to continue to educate our people. I can be found on X as well as Gab at Luther3792. Thank you.
Excellent. And Thomas?
Hello, Thomas Ryan Russo, leader, founder, chief organizer, Patriot Front, nationalist, American organizer, professional activist in a sense, and lover of history and our heritage, seeing as we are a part of it and actively perpetuating it, not just making it, but also learning it and perpetuating it as well. Back to you, Eric.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so we will move right ahead here. Thomas will actually facilitate this meeting, as well as giving the kind of thematic introduction, and it's a huge topic. I'm looking forward to it, so take it away, Thomas.
It is a huge topic. We're going to be going over a lot in this episode. It's probably not going to be satisfactory to delve into every single issue. So if you're somebody who really wants to dive into one of these issues in particular, you may have to do some research elsewhere. But this is all stage setting. The realm of Europe while we get to the birth of the European race and its ethnogenesis in America. So as we begin, America is at this time in our story and has been for countless millennia. Current anthropologists are still debating how long. The uncontested hunting grounds of innumerable tribal bands of Indians. Some of them are nomadic, some of them are sedentary. Virtually all of them, for their entire history, are Stone Age civilizations. They largely lack the written word, complex systems of agriculture, and so on. They have been squabbling back and forth over these lands, which would one day be called America or the Americas, endlessly into their largely unwritten racial past. That is clouded in myth and superstition. In many of the histories today, we only know through vague legends. Yes, and there is a lack of concrete architectural feats, as you will see in the Old World. And again, Stone Age civilizations go back thousands of years. We don't even know how long. People have their theories. That is where America is right now. Unbeknownst to them, in all their wars and legends and superstitions, Europe has begun to wake from the slumber of the Middle Ages and spread its wings across the world. After the fall of Western Rome, the power vacuum was filled by tribes, which in turn became societies, societies which became kingdoms, and kingdoms which became nations. This process incited the development of the national consciousness as we know it. Europeans became Frenchmen or Englishmen throughout this period in history, no longer, say, Burgundians or Kentishmen. This more centralized culture and system of government, where kings were able to finally leverage power over many decades and even centuries away from the feudal systems of petty dukes and princes, paved the way for more daring and decisive acts that only a more centrally organized and greater resource controlling state can make. As well, this incites greater competition between these nations, which demands more centralization, and it becomes a feedback loop and leads rise to absolutism, which later Americans have issue with, but that'll be a later episode. And we see now that ancient history became medieval history with the fall of Western Rome, as we just discussed. But medieval history becomes modern history with the fall of Eastern Rome in Constantinople. So when that happens, trade in the Mediterranean through trade routes along the Silk Road to the Far East made cities such as Venice, Florence, and Genoa into notable powers in the pre-Columbian period. This was fueled further by the Renaissance, which was in essence a resurrection of classical antiquity brought into the heart of a thoroughly Christianized Europe. So you had a sort of synthesis of the pagan classical age of Europe injected into the very modern Christendom of Europe. After the fall of Constantinople, which was, of course, the last outpost of the Roman Empire, the Ottomans and a lot of the texts from this classical age fled eastward or westward into Europe, and that was brought to Italian scholars and students, which also helped to revive Latin as the lingua franca of Europe. It grew out of simple ecclesiastical circles and grew into being the de facto language of scholars. The Ottoman Empire, riding the high watermark of Muslim territorial conquests into Europe, imposes control and high taxation on trade routes to the Far East. The wealthy nobles and aristocrats of Europe, who had grown very accustomed to the fabrics, spices, jewels, and trinkets from the mysterious lands of the Far East, such as Persia and China, they had a fascination begun with these goods going all the way back to the Crusaders when they returned from their crusades in the Holy Land. They now must look elsewhere for these goods, which creates a number of economic motivations. The printing press has been invented in this period of time, instigating a vastly wider flow of information across Europe. This is not only science, literature, discoveries of explorations, but also scripture is made available to the masses, which creates a number of religious and domestic and civil pressures on the societies we will talk about further. The compass and the astrolabe, likewise, are made available, and many naval merchants in their mastery of the coasts of Europe and the Mediterranean. Advancements in sailing technology allow vessels to sail closer into the wind and learn more about trade winds and trade routes. Trade routes trace the Horn of Africa and the far routes to Asia. The propagation of gunpowder weapons gives Europeans an unmatched advantage over more primitive adversaries, the world around, which is the only kind of adversary Europeans happen to find themselves in contact with in this age. The New World is discovered, and with it, the transfer of power. There's a global power transfer between the Mediterranean powers to the Atlantic powers, where some may still argue that it rests today. It is important to realize how massive this shift in geopolitical power was. Where once European civilization revolved around the city-states of Venice, Florence, and Genoa, for example, it is now the nation-states of Spain, Portugal, France, and England, which are poised to lead the race. Not only the race into the New World, but the European race as a whole. Alongside this geopolitical and social realignment, long-lasting religious institutions have been upset by the Protestant Reformation. The governments of Europe struggle to maintain consensus and civil tranquility among religious sects. The settlement of the New World, especially by the Anglo-Saxon race, would outweigh the internal and internecine wars and European conflicts of the previous 1,000 years in global significance. The Roman poet Horace once wrote about Virgil, who braved the sea to Athens, that one must have, quote, oak and threefold brass surrounding his heart to trust a vessel in the deep ocean. Such men, with such brass armoring their hearts, begin to make themselves known in the ports of Europe, the seas of the Atlantic, and the wilderness of America. So now we will get into the larger educational and scholarly and informational ascent of the West with Arval's section of the presentation.
All right. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I just want to stress up front, people sometimes think of European civilization as a recent thing. Deep into antiquity and even prehistory, Europe has always been the center of technological and scientific development. So going before the written word, before bronze tools, in the Paleolithic, when we do fracture analyses of spear tips and arrowheads, the fastest, most powerful projectiles are found in Western Eurasia, Europe in particular. The Neolithic Revolution gets kicked off in the Near East. At that time, though, these are people who are our ancestors, not primarily just the ancestors of modern day Near Easterners. The invention of writing, people often think belongs to the Sumerians. But actually, the Vincia culture of Southeast Europe begins producing this whole script, the Vincia script, as far back as 5 or even 6,000 years ago, or rather BC. The wheel is invented, in all likelihood, in Central Europe or possibly the Pontic-Caspian steppe. The Iron Age begins in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Of course, horse domestication, horse riding, the chariot, these things are developed by European peoples ahead of the rest of the world. Now, as we go down into classical antiquity, the Greeks really do leap ahead of the rest of the world, and it's not close. There's no close competition scientifically, mathematically between these different civilizations. Greece essentially reaches a singularity point around the year 600 BC. And that is located in the Anatolian city of Miletus in southwestern modern-day Turkey. This is the largest Ionian Greek-speaking city in the world at the time. It's kind of the center of this classical Hellenic civilization at the moment. And in that context, there are a couple things that lead to the Greeks just pulling way ahead. One is alphabetic writing. So people sometimes think that the Phoenicians came up with the first alphabet. That is not strictly true. So the Phoenicians developed a consonantal system of writing like Hebrew. Classical Hebrew only articulates, writes down the consonants, and then the vowels are left to be inferred. And that still has this problem that previous writing systems had, where you had to have basically arcane knowledge to be able to read and write. You had to be able to infer a lot of things from the text. It wasn't this simple phonetic script as we now have it, where there are vowels, consonants, you learn 24 to 26 characters, and you're all set. So the first time that comes into being is not in Phoenicia, it is in Greece. And so popular literacy begins specifically in Miletus, especially in the 7th century BC. And towards the end of that century, Thales of Miletus is born. He's the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition. We don't have direct writing from him, but he's also credited with the first deductive proof in geometry. So the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Harappan civilization in India very likely had working knowledge of engineering principles and some basic rule of thumb geometry, but they weren't able to prove deductively propositions in a mathematical science in the way that the Greeks developed it. So, this beginning of philosophical thought coincides with the beginning of modern mathematical thought. And that's really the key thing that sets the West apart from everyone else. It's why we continually have been on the cutting edge technologically. The only exception really is a couple of centuries, the Dark Ages from 600 to 1000 AD. And we'll see the reasons for that and the reason why, for a time, Islamic civilization pulls ahead technologically, mathematically. But going back to the ancients, so the first cosmologists, kind of early physicists, speculating about the shape of the Earth, already pulled ahead of other civilizations with this novel concept originated by Anaximander that Earth was actually free floating. Aristotle uses the argument that basically, and I think this is coming from Anaximander, that if there's no force impelling the Earth in any particular direction, it can simply sit there. And that was the conceptual leap that turned out to be basically true, with some caveats, that the rest of the world could not grasp. So the Chinese, even when Jesuit missionaries reached them during the late Renaissance, early modern period, they still believed that the Earth, terra firma, was resting in this kind of background cosmic ocean. All the ancient cosmologies tend to have this like cosmic ocean up there beyond the firmament, and then kind of underlying waters that the land originally came from. So Anaximander breaks that conception, and this is the beginning of scientific cosmology rather than mythological cosmology, which everybody else was still mired in. The globe Earth soon followed. So some people attribute this to Pythagoras, some to his followers. It's definitely present in Parmenides, who was also a Pythagorean of the Eleatic school. And then Plato articulates a kind of scientific cosmology with a round Earth at the center. Aristotle also places the Earth at the center, and he's the first one to start using physical proofs. Mathematical reasoning applied to physics. This is how bodies move. And his system was pretty robust. There's no comparable other system of physics from the ancient world that any other civilization developed. And we didn't surpass it ourselves until probably the 1400s or 1300s, as we'll see in this outline here. So now getting into heliocentrism, the ancients knew the Earth was round. Even people in Columbus's day understood the Earth was round. This is ancient Hellenistic wisdom that we've inherited and improved upon. Heliocentrism was first introduced arguably by a Pythagorean by the name of Philolaus, who incidentally is the guy from whom Plato supposedly bought his books on Pythagoreanism. So that's how Plato himself learned about the Pythagorean philosophy. But Philolaus put forward that there was a central fire and the Earth orbits around it. Now, it's not clear that he actually meant the sun. I think this is some kind of metaphysical doctrine, because on the other side of this central fire, there's the counter-Earth. So Earth requires some kind of contrary principle. It's an interesting set of ideas. You can find Philolaus's writings online. Arguably, they are ancient Pythagorean documents, whereas most of the stuff we have for Pythagoreans is from like the first centuries BC/AD. Heraclides Ponticus also posits that things orbit the sun, although he says that the sun orbits the Earth. It's simply Mercury and Venus that orbit the sun, and he came up with that idea to explain some eccentricities in the orbits of Mercury and Venus. But again, scientific reasoning rather than mythological thought. Heraclides Ponticus was a member of Plato's Academy. Plato didn't just come up with a philosophy himself. He developed a research academy and had a program of directed study. He kind of called for the development of stereometry, or the geometry of solids, in the Republic and elsewhere. So this worked. It was the first research institute in Western civilization, and it came up with a whole bunch of mathematical innovations. as well as before them, the Pythagoreans, which was a more informal kind of school environment. And Heraclides Ponticus also believed that each star had its own Earth-like body orbiting it. Arguably, actually, that idea went back all the way to Anaximander around 600 BC. Aristarchus of Samos lived 310 to 230 BC. He first firmly put the sun, as we know it, at the center and said the Earth rotates around the sun. And I believe he also said the Earth rotates on its axis. Ancient people used to explain the movement of the stars throughout the night by saying they themselves are spinning and we're fixed. He said, nope, we're spinning and also we're orbiting the sun. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, from 276 to 194 BC, he was the one to really come up with a precise measurement of the size of the Earth. And he did this using pretty simple geometrical principles and mundane observation. So he found two cities on the same meridian, or the same latitudinal line, Alexandria and modern day Aswan, or Syene at the time. They're 5,000 stadia apart. And he knew that Aswan is on it's on the Tropic of Cancer. And so on the summer, not equinox, but solstice, summer solstice, the sun comes straight down on that location so that nothing casts a shadow. Of course, people would have known this, and he finds this other city on the same meridian and decides to test with a gnomon, or a stick coming out of the ground, at exactly noon on that day, the summer solstice, what is the angle of the shadow. And he calculated that it was 7.2 degrees, or simply measured that. And then knowing that 7.2 degrees is 1/50th of the 360 degrees of the full circle of the Earth, he was able to correctly calculate the distance between, or rather infer that because the distance between Alexandria and Aswan is 5,000 stadia, that you multiply that by 50 to get the actual size of the Earth. And he was right. He's within like 1% error, if there even was an error, because we don't know precisely what a stadia was, but he was extremely close. Soon after this, 190 to 120 BC, we have Hipparchus. He developed systematic astronomy. There's all sorts of astronomical observations before this and some theories in physics. And then Hipparchus is the one that really brings mathematical precision. But Ptolemy is the one that gets credit for that, because he kind of writes the famous textbook that puts together all these findings. And Ptolemy also does come up with some kind of perfection elements of the system, 86 AD to 165 AD. So that's just in physics and cosmology. No one else is at the same level in those days. So mathematically speaking, like I said, Thales develops deductive proof. Pythagoras develops number theory and geometry. When you study the history of geometry, a lot of things come from the Pythagorean school. Euclid writes his famous textbook. There were other elements of geometry prior to Euclid, and most of the stuff in Euclid isn't authored by Euclid. Most of it comes from the Pythagoreans. And Euclid, according to later authors, was a Platonist himself, affiliated with the academy. So part of this broader research institution project. Further along than Euclid, we have Archimedes, who develops mechanics scientifically and builds all these neat machines and things, some of which maybe are mythical, but he was one of the last defenders of Greek civilization against the Romans in Syracuse. And he had all of these soldiers carry concave mirrors, and then that reflected the sunlight on the sails of the Romans and burst them into flame. So things like that, and then other just neat gadgets. So he was sort of like Galileo much later, inventing all these war machines. He also made developments in conics in terms of pure mathematics. Diophantus of Alexandria, a little known figure, he actually developed algebra. People credit the Arabs with this, but algebra, most of the work was done by this Diophantus from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, Greek mathematician. Now, as we get towards the end of antiquity, it is the case that accelerated scientific and mathematical development kind of tails off. People become more metaphysically inclined and reactionary too. As Christianity rises, the pagan philosophers feel the need to defend more and more rigorously their pagan worldview. And so Neoplatonism basically consolidates all of the different philosophical schools and really becomes the system of education. The Neoplatonic curriculum, devised by Iamblichus in the 4th century AD, that's essentially the schematic or outline of the schools of late antiquity. There's 2 major schools, one in Athens and one in Alexandria. There's a major school also in Syria, and Constantinople also receives a larger school around this time. So the pagan world kind of consolidates all of its resources, but at the same time, they're the ones training the bureaucrats. So when Justinian and the Christians basically seize power completely and outlaw paganism in some instances, they force the pagan philosophy professors to convert. At first, they allow them to teach, but they just say, like, hey, downplay the paganism, emphasize Aristotle instead of Plato. Plato talks about the gods all the time. Aristotle doesn't. So this is kind of the direction things take. And the early Christian scholasticism, as evinced by, say, John Philoponus, who is a critic of Proclus, and he's the author of the cosmological argument, also another thing incorrectly attributed to the Arabs, but he directly comes out of these Neoplatonic schools, specifically the school in Alexandria in his case. So Christian scholasticism, as we know it, is simply an outgrowth of this Neoplatonism, which gathers together all this wisdom of antiquity. Mathematical education, all of that is done within this essentially Pythagorean Platonic framework, then synthesizing Stoic developments, synthesizing Aristotelian development. So it's really just all in a package there, ready to go be kind of stolen away or harbored in the monasteries, where it does get preserved in many cases. Some of these texts, like in Ireland, there are major monasteries that are preserving all sorts of writings that are absent elsewhere. So that's the state of the beginning of the Dark Ages. There is probably a general demographic decline. There's the plague of Justinian, I think, in the 6th, or rather 7th century AD. So things are not going well for a number of reasons. There's also the Byzantine-Sasanian War. So the late Persians have been battling with the Byzantines from 602 through 628 AD, and they've exhausted all of their men and resources. The Byzantines are broke, and through 632 AD, did I say BC before? 632 AD, Abu Bakr begins the Islamic conquests. He's the father-in-law of Muhammad. They basically stayed more or less in Arabia during Muhammad's lifetime. He dies, and now Islam just is out of the bag and starts being very aggressive, and really strikes at exactly this key time when the strength of both of these empires, the Byzantines and the Persians, are diminished. They basically shut off access to a lot of these ancient texts that were in Alexandria, in Syria, in the whole Near Eastern sphere. Constantinople keeps a lot of stuff over time. Eventually, of course, the Byzantine Empire just shrinks to Constantinople, and learning is stifled everywhere else. In the meantime, in Constantinople, there's actually a lot of technological development still. So they don't stop innovating. They develop Greek fire, which arguably we still don't have the recipe for. It burns on the surface of the water. It allowed them to save Constantinople from Arab ships multiple times. They developed the trebuchet in these days. They're maintaining classical learning, but obviously they are just a shell of their former Hellenistic civilization, which was vast, and they've lost a lot of their writings. So the Arabs control those things. They start researching into the same line of development. And a lot of these same ethnic groups, like the Persians, they had access to Hellenistic learning and mathematics as well. So it's sort of just the title gets shifted from Hellenistic, late Roman civilization to Arabic civilization. But they do make some developments, but largely the asymmetry there in the Dark Ages, it's that they had the text, they inherited the institutions and physical cities. The Eastern Empire was shrunken to a shell of its former self. The Western Empire was cut off from all that learning. They couldn't even get texts from Constantinople easily because of Arab pirates patrolling the Mediterranean, or they would tax these trade routes. So it became much more difficult to have that kind of common koine, which Hellenistic learning depended on. That the classical system of the paideia, or education of a young man, was essentially sending young men off to various teachers in different places. So the advances in the ancient world kind of depended on a form of cosmopolitanism that became impossible with Arab conquests. So then we move into the Dark Ages. Western Europe, they still have some texts. The Carolingian Renaissance happens. Charlemagne really wants to recover some of this learning. He's aware to some extent of what they've lost. They still have, Roman history and authors like Cicero. They have a lot of texts like books of prayers, hours, and stuff. They have Boethius. He's one of these late Neoplatonic authors that they still do have. And they have some of his mathematical texts, but they're really not the cutting edge mathematical theory of the Greeks in general. The Neoplatonists, they liked teaching the math, but they basically stuck to the quadrivium, the simple stuff. Boethius wasn't like a cutting edge thinker of his day. He was just carrying on this general Neoplatonic system. Charlemagne also commissioned a handbook, the Handbook of 809, summarizing all astronomical knowledge. So they're trying to get it back. They recognize they have this lost knowledge in the Middle Ages. Medieval universities start coming up, and they basically operate like the ancient schools. So the ancient schools, apart from Plato's Academy, which was a physical place you would go to, the other ones, they would be like a research library and then a lot of visiting scholars who would offer their services. So the University of Oxford in the early days was like this. They had common libraries, they shared some facilities, but basically it was a lot of just independent professors teaching classes there. That's the state of these medieval universities, following the same model from antiquity, more or less. There's now Gilbert of Aurillac from 946 to 1003 AD. He is later known as Pope Sylvester II. He's one of the main figures bringing a lot of these texts from the Islamic world into translations of Greek texts, mostly. A lot of this learning, bringing it back to the West, because he has the opportunity to go to the Spanish March, Catalonia specifically. When he was 21, Count Borrell II of Barcelona went to visit his hometown in France, and someone recommended that he take this Gerbert, future Sylvester II, along so he can go study with some of these scholars in the Spanish March. That's basically a buffer zone that was established between Andalusian Spain and then the Frankish Empire. So you have all of these polities, and a lot of them are Christian, but a lot of them have access to some of these Islamic texts, and they're learning the language. Some of these figures, like Averroes, is the Latinate name for one of these famous Islamic scholars. So a lot of stuff is preserved there. Gerbert goes and gets access to it, and he also goes to Rome, ends up tutoring Otto II, the Holy Roman Emperor, and he leads the cathedral school at Reims. He builds an organ there using a lot of this knowledge that he's gained, like a pipe organ, and it's one of the best pipe organs apparently at the time. He reintroduced, or really introduced, Arabic numerals, which ultimately originate from India, incidentally, but they're a lot easier to calculate with. So this allows him, with his abacus, which he has, to perform calculations way faster than anyone else. I think people accuse him of magic as well. So he reintroduced celestial spheres, armillary spheres, astrolabes, observation tubes, water clocks, a lot of scientific instruments that allow for a revamped astronomical science. Moving on, Adelard of Bath from 1060 to 1160 AD, first complete Latin translation of Euclid's Elements. So we're getting it back. We're catching up with where the West kind of fell off when we lost this heritage. He translated also Arabic astronomical and mathematical texts, largely developed off of the Greeks. Leonardo of Pisa, 1170 to 1250, also known as Fibonacci. He wrote a book of calculation that really systematized a lot of arithmetic of his day. He introduced algebraic geometry to Europe. He advanced number theory, genuine invention there, or discovery rather, the Fibonacci sequence. Jordanus de Nemore, he flourished in the 13th century. Nothing is known of his life, but this is where you really get the first jumping out ahead of Europeans out in front of the Arabic world. So he axiomatized arithmetic in his Arithmetica. He developed algebra, working on this Greek and then Islamic work. He wrote an Elements on the Proof of Weights, which was really the foundation of modern mechanics. And this is where Europe, for the first time, really jumps back into the lead. And from that point forward, the lead just keeps on being built up. So Campanus of Novara, 1220 to 1296, wrote textbooks on geometry, astronomy, astrology. He devised trigonometric tables for calculation, improved scientific instruments. And now in the mid 1300s, we have the Oxford calculators. They're arguably ahead of their time and way ahead of all of the Islamic scholars. So they're based out of the Merton School at Oxford. We have Thomas Brandywine, Archbishop of Canterbury for a brief spell. He corrected an Aristotelian law of motion. He discovered that velocity scales logarithmically, not arithmetically, with the ratio of force to resistance. So he's improving these formula, improving on Aristotle in very tangible ways, arguably for the first time. William Haighesbury, almost done here with this section. Instantaneous velocity concept. That's the idea that at one point in time, there is a velocity that a moving body has. He developed the mean speed theorem. So a constantly accelerating object travels the same distance as would have been arrived at by half of its terminal velocity. So just coming up with these formulations that are useful for mechanics. John Dumbleton, he improved applied kinematics, laws of falling bodies, projectile motion, a lot of stuff that we associate with figures like Galileo, that Galileo drew upon. Richard Swineshead, he analyzed infinite series, limits, and convergence, anticipating some developments in calculus centuries later, calculated motion resistant media, variable forces, very, very advanced stuff. Now, around the same time in Paris, out of their university there was the Parisian impetus school. This is like replacing the Aristotelian theory of how bodies preserve or don't preserve their motion. So this is like the antecessor of the modern theory of momentum. So basically this impetus is a thing that transfers between bodies, and that's how you can account for some phenomena of motion. So they developed that along very mathematical principles. John Philoponus was the first one to suggest an impetus theory, that early Christian scholastic philosopher from the 600s AD. There's Nicolai Oresme, the most accomplished of the Parisian impetus school, 1320 to 1382. He helped to develop coordinate systems, velocity time graphs. He proved mathematically the mean speed theorem, which the other Oxford guys discovered. He developed probability theory. He speculated on the incommensurability of the motions of the heavenly bodies, moving away from this clockwork universe into something much more like modern astronomy and cosmology. Now, it's around a century later then that we get the printing press. Literacy is hugely expanded in these days. Again, we have alphabeticy in the West. In China, they had block printing. They had movable type even. In Korea, they developed metal forms for movable type. But they had logographic scripts. So their characters represented whole concepts or words, which means they have thousands of characters. So that's just not workable in either for printing purposes or for teaching the masses how to read and write. So in the West, we had alphabeticy that allowed people, ordinary people, to read and write. In Northern Europe, around 1300, maybe 10% of the population could read compared to probably a fraction of 1% in China. So yeah, the kind of environment is key for it. The religious motives are there. People want to read texts, prayer books, things like that. And we also get paper in the 13th century introduced to Europe. That's a lot cheaper. If the printing press came around, but we didn't have paper to print on, well, vellum is expensive. That's what books used to be written on. It's hides, essentially. And it's cost prohibitive. So we got paper. We already had the screw press for pressing wine. Now, metal casting got incredibly sophisticated because of European gunsmithing. And so all of these we had oil-based ink that would stick to the metal, developed in the artistic traditions, especially in the Netherlands. So all of these things come together. We have a population that's already more literate, that's actually ahead of everyone else scientifically and mathematically at that point. More universities. This is like genuinely Christendom at that point. It's unified under the Catholic Church. Everyone's going to the same universities. It's already kicking off. And then Gutenberg comes along, son of a patrician father and like a commoner mother. His father was master of accounts for the city, and he also worked for the mint. Both of those jobs Gutenberg himself couldn't have because he was not a patrician like his father because of his commoner ancestry. So he had to look elsewhere for his career. His years, by the way, 1400 to 1468. So he gets into a few different industries. He's a merchant. In 1439, he lost some money trying to make polished mirrors for capturing holy light from relics to sell to pilgrims, specifically in Aachen. So there was going to be an exhibition of these religious artifacts, relics from Charlemagne, actually, and they were going to be displayed in 1439. A huge flood happened, and then that exhibition was delayed. So Gutenberg was left sitting on all sorts of these mirrors that he could not unload. So he was not the luckiest guy. He works for the next 10 years from 1440 to 1450, very intensively doing the research to make the printing press happen. Apparently he has this concept. He wants to see it realized. Little is known about the period. But finally, in 1450, the first press is actually made in Mainz, financed by Johann Fust. Fust actually later on sues Gutenberg because he says that he didn't live up to his end of the deal. So Fust gains control of Gutenberg's press. Again, Gutenberg not the luckiest guy, but it's not the saddest ending. In 1465, Archbishop Adolf von Nassau finally recognized Gutenberg's achievements. He didn't die without some recognition. He was given the title, finally, of Hofmann, which included a stipend, as well as 2,180 liters of grain and 2,000 liters of wine, tax-free. 3 years later, Gutenberg dies, hopefully not because of the wine. We're not exactly sure. Renaissance now is firmly underway. Just a few more figures that I think deserve to be mentioned because this is why, we are the ones to develop this civilization in the New World and not the Chinese or something. So Columbus is alive during these years, 1451 through 1506. That's roughly contemporary with Da Vinci, 1452 to 1519. Da Vinci's famous, obviously, for his very accurate anatomical drawings, bringing back dissection to learn exactly how muscles connect and all that. He invented concepts of armored tanks, machine guns, parachutes, aerial screws, helicopters, basically. So a lot of this stuff, actually, when we reproduce it today or build his specifications, the stuff works. So the guy was way ahead of his time. Then there's Paracelsus, ahead of his time in biology, 1493 to 1541. He lectured in German instead of Latin, so this kind of populist nationalist sentiment is on the rise. Moved from a humor theory of the body to a chemical theory and explained impairments by chemical imbalance. He was the first to use minerals and chemicals in medicine. He replaced the 4-element theory with a 3-chemical theory. So he thought everything boiled down to a principle of salt, principle of sulfur, and principle of mercury. Salt was corporeality and fixed structure, or the bodily component. Sulfur was combustibility, reactivity, and the soul element. And then mercury was mobility, fluidity, and spirit. He coined the phrase, the dose makes the poison. Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, published on the day that he died. Goes without saying what he's famous for. Modern day heliocentrism. Around this time, 1516 to 1558, Mary I, Bloody Mary, lives. Just to give you a reference, so Girolamo Cardano, 1501 to 1576, another mathematical genius in Europe, published the first general solution to cubic equations, systematic use of negative numbers for the first time, first to work with complex numbers. We are light years ahead of the rest of the world in terms of math at this point. Developed probability theory in a fully fledged way. He was a gambling addict, so he wrote this book on games of chance and how to win at them. So he developed new math to do that effectively. He invented the Cardan joint, which allows transmission of rotary motion at different angles, which is still used in drive shafts today. Andreas Vesalius, 1514 to 1564. He wrote On the Fabric of the Human Body, founded modern anatomy. Gessner, 1516 to 1568, founded modern zoology and also basically modern botany. Bernardo Telesio, he was an anti-Aristotelian, broad conceptual thinker. Bacon really liked him, called him the first modern thinker in the Baconian sense. And I do want to get to Bacon at the end of this because he is, in many ways, we are the Baconian civilization. And we'll see what I mean by that. So matter, let's see. William Gilbert, 1544 to 1608. He wrote On the Magnet and on the Great Magnet of the Earth, developed the science of magnetism and differentiated magnetism from static electricity. He explained the phenomenon of poles in magnets and invented the versorium, which is the first instrument ever to measure electric charge. And then Elizabeth I lives for reference from 1533 to 1603. And now we finally get to Francis Bacon. He wasn't exactly a great mathematician or even scientist. He was a great philosopher, though, and he really inaugurated modern empirical science. It's not that empirical work hadn't been done before or experimental science hadn't been done, but he really called for it and systematized it. He wrote the New Organon, which is essentially supposed to replace the Aristotelian organon or instrument of learning, which for Aristotle was all logical science. For Bacon, it's all empirical science and empirical experimental methods. Bacon has an interesting life, and he is very relevant for the period that we're coming up to for next week, not next week, but next session on Jamestown. So Bacon, he's the son of Elizabeth's Lord Keeper. The Lord Keeper is someone who keeps the key to the Great Seal, which is like the official seal for all the documents, also a trusted advisor of the monarch. So Bacon's dad is that for Elizabeth, and he has a somewhat tenuous relationship with Elizabeth. She's impressed with him. Of course, she's much older, but also doesn't like his ambition and thinks that he's a little bit too airy-fairy with all the philosophy and wishes he would be more practical. But he does become Queen's Counsel in legal terms under Elizabeth. And then his fortunes kind of improve under James. So when James succeeds the throne in 1603, he is knighted officially. He becomes Solicitor General in 1607 and Attorney General in 1613, the Lord Keeper, like his dad, 1617, and Lord Chancellor, his highest ranking position, 1618. Unfortunately, he is disgraced and barred from any government position in 1621 when he's charged with corruption. This case has been relitigated over the centuries, figuratively speaking, and it's not clear that he really was guilty of corruption. He had enemies that he had made politically. So he was out of politics. In his last years of his life, he writes on plantations, where he really sets out a colonial program for how we should be developing these colonies in the New World. He writes The New Atlantis, which puts forward this concept, obviously inspired by the idea of the New World, to have this kind of secret society, a research laboratory kind of society where you have special chambers deep down in the earth for studying barometric pressure. And you have like towers for studying phenomena in the upper atmosphere. And it's just way ahead of its time thinking. And he was one of the chief advisors to James, who establishes, or rather approves, the charter of Jamestown. Not only that, but Bacon is actually a council member of the Virginia Company, which is the company that actually itself establishes Jamestown. So Bacon, the eminent philosopher in England during those days, advisor to Elizabeth and James, loves the idea of the New World, inspired by that, thinks we have to go beyond the ancients, say they didn't know about this New World, now we do, we're ahead of them in math. Like, he was aware of the feat that had been accomplished in the last couple centuries in Europe. So he coined the phrase knowledge is power, and he had this vision for a new kind of scientific, technocratic state that ultimately, I would argue, has been manifested. He wasn't without his religious side, though. He was a devout Anglican, and he coined the phrase, a little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion. So that section was a bit long, but I did want to give a good intro and get us up to speed. Now, here we are on the eve of settlement in the New World. And Thomas, back to you.
Early transoceanic navigation, which will be presented by James and Jim. So whichever of you is first, please take it away.
Thank you, Thomas. Picture the Atlantic Ocean in the 1400s, wide, unknown, and largely unchallenged by Europeans. There were no accurate charts, no way to measure longitude to know just how far west you'd sailed. Just wind, waves, wooden holes, courage, and perhaps a certain amount of dumb luck. And into this watery void marched the kingdoms of Europe, desperate for a way around the rising Ottoman Empire and the old maritime trading monopolies of Genoa and Venice. This is the story of the first true arms race on the open sea. In 1453, Constantinople falls. Trade from Asia, such as spices, silks, and all manner of Oriental luxuries, become expensive, restricted, and unpredictable to obtain. Europe has two choices: find a new route or fall behind. Portugal takes the lead under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator. Their caravels creep down the west coast of Africa. They settled the mid-Atlantic Azores in the 1420s, Cape Verde off the African coast in the 1450s, and slowly they learn the behavior of the Atlantic wind systems. Spain watches from the sidelines, busy conquering the Canary Islands themselves throughout the 1400s, until they see what these discoveries mean. By mid-century, Portuguese and Spanish sailors have discovered a powerful secret. The Atlantic is not chaos, it is a machine. Up north around the Azores, winds blow eastward, making westbound travel tedious, if not impossible. Down south, near the Canaries and the Cape Verde, they blow west, out into the vast unexplored ocean. These patterns, called the Volta del Mar, or the turn of the sea, allow sailors to ride a predictable conveyor belt across the ocean. This is ultimately how Columbus does it. On 4 voyages, he stops at either the Canaries or Cape Verde, catches the westbound winds, and lets the Atlantic carry him like a massive river. Europe suddenly realizes an amazing fact: the ocean is crossable. But success across the Atlantic brings conflict. In 1494, Spain and Portugal nearly come to blows over these new lands. So the Valentian Pope Alexander VI brokers a deal. He draws a line down the map, 370 leagues west of Cape Verde. Everything west goes to Spain, everything east to Portugal. The Treaty of Tordesillas turns the entire world into a 2-player game. Every coastline, every island, every unknown shore, divided now between Spain and Portugal. Obviously, the other European powers weren't going to be bound by this restriction. Whether Catholic France or Protestant England or Holland, other powers were primed to settle the New World in short order. And this rush to build overseas empires supercharges the race for ships, ports, and maps. To cross the Atlantic, and more importantly, to return safely, Europe needs better naval technology. Shipbuilders transform from aging cog-style ships into sleek new designs. Caravels that can tack into the wind, carracks and naus big enough to survive long voyages and withstand high waves, and eventually the mighty galleon, the premier example of naval technological advancement, purpose-built for war and ocean travel. Mixed rigging appears: square sails for power, lateen triangular sails for maneuverability. More masts, deeper holes, stronger timbers when building these fleets designed to conquer the New World. Every new voyage pushes the technology forward. But even with better ships, sailors still need to know where they are. They use the improved magnetic compass. They use the astrolabe and the quadrants to fix latitude. And they use the cross staff and the back staff to measure the sun's angle. When all else fails, they use dead reckoning, estimating their position by speed, direction, and hope. But cumulative estimation errors lead to being miles off course, or worse, dashing your fleet into shallow shoals. This is because accurately determining your longitude remains a mystery, unsolved until the 1700s. For the early explorers, finding approximate longitude is less a science and more an educated gamble, a gamble that often led to disastrous payoffs. But regardless of these potential tragedies, every successful voyage becomes a geopolitical asset. Spain maintains the Padrón Real, a master map updated after every voyage. Portugal keeps an even more guarded chart, the Padrão Real, similar name, different kingdom. Both grand maps are locked away like nuclear launch codes. Each edition and relative position a carefully guarded secret to be kept from the competing empires intent on dominating the same newly discovered lands. To lose a map is to lose an empire. By the end of the 1400s, the Atlantic, once seen as an impassable expanse, has become a highway. Thanks to improved ships, mastered wind patterns, new tools, guarded maps, and the sheer nerve of sailors and captains involved, Europe's influence has burst beyond its borders. The age of exploration isn't just about discovering new lands. It's about mastering the ocean, the biggest, most dangerous frontier on Earth, and rewriting the map of the world forever. It took men of courage, men who didn't know if they would make it to the other side, or even if they would make it back home one day. These were brave European men who quite frankly possessed the sort of gumption that built not only the future nation known as the United States of America, but our entire modern world. Thank you.
Jim, you're up.
So the commencement of sustained European transatlantic voyaging in the late 15th century represents not just a sudden advent of exploratory zeal, not just courage, but it's the hard-won culmination of incremental advancements across multiple disciplines. Successful colonization required the prior convergence of interlocking systems, things like maritime technology capable of surviving open ocean passages, scientific methods for determining geographic position at sea, and certain geopolitical and economic structures that allowed for the financing and, even more importantly, the motivation of high-risk ventures. We're all familiar with some of the pre-Columbian expeditions to the New World, but we wouldn't see long-term colonization of the New World until the mid-15th century or the mid to late 15th century for these reasons. So prior to the mid-15th century, dominant European designs were fundamentally unsuited for the demands of prolonged oceanic voyages. These are vessels that had their origin in northern European coastal and Baltic trade routes. They're pretty close to shore. Their primary deep water vessels, the cog and some of the earlier carracks, think of them more so as larger barges. They're intended primarily for trade. They're designed in the context of coastal trade and coastal conflict. They had what's called a high freeboard, or the height of the hull over the water line. They had prominent superstructures, forecastles and stern castles that not only provided for defense in the sort of naval combat that existed at the time, which involved a lot of ramming and boarding and things of that nature, but it also provided extra storage. Now, when you start to take these ships out of coastal waters, that the fact that the vessel's center of gravity is relatively high, it catches wind, it rolls in violent seas, which makes them particularly dangerous in the open Atlantic, increasing the risk of capsizing or losing mass or things that would be certainly detrimental to the long-haul expeditions. The hull types themselves as well, the hull construction was important. Prior to the innovations, mostly by the Portuguese, but of the caravel and the galleon, many ships had what's called clinker built or overlapping wooden planks riveted together, sort of akin to Viking longships. They're strong against blunt impacts. It created a relatively rigid hull, but that rigidity made it suffer from powerful hogging and sagging forces, they'd call them, or flexing of the hull convexly and concavely. Later Mediterranean ships and these early Atlantic Ocean going ships would have what they call carvel built hulls. The planks are laid end to end on a rigid skeleton frame, allows for larger, more flexible and watertight hulls. Rigging and sail configuration, as my colleague touched on, early cogs and early carracks were square rigged, meaning that they're only efficient when you're sailing downwind or with the wind directly astern. It performed poorly when sailing across the wind and was virtually incapable of sailing against it. You could change the orientation of the sail at this time, but it required sailors to go aloft in dangerous conditions, manipulate heavy yards, and reducing the sail area quickly was virtually impossible to do, leaving ships highly susceptible to sudden sea squalls. This was solved by the triangular shaped sails that were earlier mentioned. Steering mechanisms also pretty darn important. So prior to the caravels, prior to these larger ocean-going ships that we're probably more familiar with, more prevalent than a stern rudder, as we would understand it, would be the use of a side steering oar or a side rudder mounted on one of the starboard quarters. Creates significant drag, it's imprecise, it relies on muscular control, certainly not suited to volatile seas. So what are the solutions, right? Well, if you're going to design a ship that is able to go across the Atlantic or in any open ocean condition, you're going to need to do a couple of things that the Portuguese were able to accomplish. So they designed ships that had low profiles, sleek hulls, low freeboard, minimal superstructure, high speed, low drag, improving stability. It had a very long, very shallow draft. It was much more hydrodynamic, which is crucial for the exploration, not just of violent open ocean, but also of uncharted coastal and riverine environments where there are rocky bottoms on which you can easily gut the bottom of your ship. Sail plans had to change, as we spoke about as well. But there's also a sort of cognitive problem involved in navigation on a featureless ocean. So one of the things unique to our people's ability to navigate the oceans was their ability to solve higher order complex intellectual problems. So even if you had a capable vessel with it's futile, it's useless without the means to properly guide it in the open ocean. Reliable blue water navigation revolves around solving two distinct positional problems. So latitude, that's relatively easily solvable. They had worked it out centuries before Columbus navigated the ocean. Longitude is the larger of the two problems. So latitude is the north-south position that's achieved. You can achieve and determine what your latitude is through celestial observation. You had to have specific instruments, an astrolabe that was mentioned before. It's a heavy bronze ring, or it's mounted on a heavy bronze ring for stable use on a deck. Cross staffs and back staffs were allowed for the measuring of the angle of the sun or the North Star over the horizon, utilizing solar and stellar almanacs that had existed for a long period of time and required pretty extensive observation and deductive reasoning, such as Regiment of the Pole Star or Almanac Perpetuum, existed at the time. Refinement of the magnetic compass is also a key problem to solve. So the compass is in the same vein as gunpowder, where yes, these technologies were known for some time. Yes, they did have their origin, as best we can tell, in ancient China, but there's a very real difference between magnetizing an iron needle and creating a compass that's capable of assisting you with precise navigation and also capable of being used on a deck on an ocean-going vessel that's pitching and rolling and that sort of thing. So they created things to tackle these problems, such as dry pivot mounting. So no longer did you have to set your magnetized iron needle in a bowl of water. You can now mount it inside of a more portable fixture. They created things like the balance card, or we would know it more commonly as a compass rose or a wind rose. It's all well and good to know where north is, but you have to be able to take precise bearing with a degree of accuracy. So as far as it goes with latitude and longitude, the way you work out longitude, as I said earlier, is pretty easy on land. So they knew that there was a distinct difference between certain commonly observable celestial events, most commonly solstices, but they also used things like the movement of Jupiter's moon. And they knew if you could observe these two events and note the time in two specific locations, you could work the math back to determine rather easily, because both navigation and time are measured in base 60, the distance between a meridian, a known north-south parallel, and where you are. But that's rather problematic at sea because working out when noon is part of the problem. So you could try setting a clock to the time of a known meridian, but clocks at the time were not practical at sea. They were made of fragile components. They were subject to expansion and contraction. They didn't do well with pitching and rolling. They would lose time. They would speed up. So what you would have to do to counteract, or rather until the invention of the maritime chronometer sometime later, you would have to use a couple of different things. So my colleague alluded to the system of dead reckoning. So what you would do at this point in time is you would use certain charts you had, work out where you were on in east-west positioning. So you could tell by measuring the depth below keel, you could tell by looking at islands around you where you were on your charts, and then you would have to sail due north, due south to get past those obstacles and continue sailing east-west because you couldn't work out your longitude. So that's another problem that they had to solve at this point in time. Yeah, I think that about covers this section. Some of the other things that we're going to move on and talk about are some of the geopolitical things that allowed for exploration at this time, as well as economic things that came together in a sort of confluence at the right place and time in history to allow for exploration, colonization of the New World, and the founding of America. So with that, I will pass the torch here.
We are moving on to Brant's presentation on the Columbus and the early Spanish voyages. So we've just learned about the methods and the means, and now we're going to learn about the actual actions themselves. Go ahead, Brant.
Yeah, you hear me okay?
Yes, sir, we do.
Okay, thank you. So what I want to start with is the Reconquista of Spain, because that's the platform for the Spanish conquistadors going forth into the New World. And I'll just mention that the Muslims invaded Spain in 711, and it took almost 800 years to get them out of there. In 1491, they finally had the siege of Granada. They were just about to get them out. And in early January 1492, they were finally rid of that Muslim threat. Now, up until that time, Columbus had gone to Portugal, England, France, and Spain previously, asking them to fund his voyage to the New World. And they said, no, we're not going to do it. It's very risky, and your calculations of the circumference of the planet is wrong. And Columbus was going off of a map which was inaccurate, and his calculations were wrong, but he was also an extremely good navigator. And someone might ask, well, how was Columbus able to perform this task when no one else had done that yet? And you might as well say, well, how was Neil Armstrong able to walk on the moon? Let's go ask Neil how he was able to do it. These guys were embedded in Western civilization. The technology was sufficient at the time to get it done. They were funded by a state, and these guys were highly trained, and they also had competent men with them. Now, having said that, Columbus just barely pulled this off by the skin of his teeth. So there was seaweed and vegetation in the water as they were sailing across the Atlantic. The crew was getting quite upset and nervous at this point, and they were ready to mutiny. Columbus gave a little speech to them saying that, look, if you give me 3 more days, if we don't spot land, we'll turn this ship around. And they did spot land within those 3 days. He thought that he had met Indians from India, so he named them that. So we have been stuck with that nomenclature ever since then. There's different accounts of how well or how roughly Columbus and others treated different natives there. So this is a bit conflicting, and I don't want to go down into a rabbit hole where that goes. But you can suffice it to say that depending upon the conquistadors and the governorship they had over different areas, they treated the Amerindians the way that they thought was best. And they did use the Amerindians as labor to extract gold and extract silver. Because, as I'm sure you guys have probably said before, this is the new playground for the European powers. And they are now in a race using these new resources here. This is their new playground. About 30 years after Columbus made his first voyage, Spain started colonizing Central America and parts of the Caribbean and northern South America. One of the things that I did want to mention that I just skipped right over is that part of that new technology, some of the guys already mentioned, there were deeper rudders and deeper keels on these ships, and Columbus used the square sails, which caught the wind from behind, but he also used that triangular lantine sail, which pointed directly at the front of the ship, and that would allow the ships to tack into the wind unless it was blowing directly into their face. And Columbus also realized that he had to head down south to the Canary Islands and then scoot across at a more southern latitude, because those are the prevailing winds that would take him to the New World, or what he thought was Asia. And in order to get back to Europe, you have to tack up north to catch the prevailing winds that go back towards Europe, and then you can take those over. So those sailing ships would kind of move in a circular pattern. They didn't have any other choice because they were under wind power. Now, the conquistadors were motivated by a variety of factors. Of course, there was wealth, there was fame. Some of them wanted the power, some of them were even granted governorships over certain areas, and some of them were religiously inclined. And one of the impetus, the driving forces behind Columbus, as far as Isabella was concerned, was spreading the religion to the New World, because she was a very religious lady. So I want to talk about two conquistadors that were cousins, or sorry, second cousins, and then a couple of Englishmen that were second cousins. Conquistadors. In 1519, Hernan Cortez was in Cuba, and he got permission to sail to South America and investigate, or sorry, I should say Central America. Now, the governor of Cuba pulled back that permission before he was able to launch his ships, but he launched his ships, he scuttled his ships so his crew couldn't leave, and then he went inland. Now, these conquistadors were extremely hard men. They fought not only the native people at the time, which included arrows, which they ignored for the most part, as the arrows lodged into their bodies because they weren't fatal, until they found out that some of the tribes used poison arrows, which was fatal. So they had to come up with strategies to counteract that. Sometimes they starved to death. Sometimes they died from exposure. They died from disease, and they were bitten up by mosquitoes while they were doing all of this. And most of them did not stop. They took extremely heavy losses, but there was always some of them that were surviving and willing to push forward. To summarize what happened with Cortez is he met different tribes along the way that fought him. Some of them decided to ally with him because they could not beat the conquistadors. One of these tribes was from Tlaxcala, and they allied with the conquistadors against the Aztecs, because the Aztecs, they were the big man on campus. They were subduing everyone else. They were more powerful, and they went out to surrounding tribes to grab some of those people to sacrifice them to the gods, so the gods would be happy. The other tribes were not happy with that. When the conquistadors saw Tenochtitlan, they were awestruck because it was something almost magical, because it's built in this big lake and there were 3 causeways running to it. That is now modern day Mexico City, after it had been destroyed, rebuilt, and the lake has been drained away. But I skip forward a little bit when I say that. What happened was there was some friction between the Aztecs and the conquistadors. The conquistadors were not happy with the religious icons and these strange demonic creatures that were painted on the walls of their temples. They said, hey, you need to put up a picture of the Virgin Mary. That's what you need to do. And the Aztecs were not happy with that. So there was a little bit of friction. And also, while this was going on, the governor of Cuba that had withdrawn his permission to Cortez sent a group of conquistadors to go grab him and bring him back. Now, Cortez learned about this through some of his allies. So he took some of his men, left Tenochtitlan, ambushed the conquistadors that came to get him, defeated them, and convinced them to come back and help him. Now, while that was going on, Montezuma's boys started carrying out some human sacrifices. As they did, the conquistadors were not happy with that, and according to accounts, they murdered 20 or 30 of the priests that were carrying this out. So you can imagine the Aztecs were not happy about this. that caused even more conflict. The conquistadors, as Cortez was gone, they arrest Montezuma, their leader, put him under house arrest, and they're trying to get him to talk to his people to calm them down. They bring him outside, and Montezuma is killed by his own people through some sort of missile weapons. Cortez finally makes it back. All hell is breaking loose in Tenochtitlan. They decide to fight their way out. The Aztecs destroy the 3 causeways, so they can't get out. So the conquistadors and their Tlaxcala allies that are with them are having to build a causeway to get out of there. They lose a third of their men, their weapons, their horses, and then they are pursued through the jungle, and they have to turn and fight against the Aztecs, who outnumber them 20-1. And they hold off the Aztecs, and the Aztecs finally retreat back to Tenochtitlan. The conquistadors are licking their wounds, and they are figuring out plans with other tribes there, especially the Tlaxcala, which are the most powerful. They wind up building ships, cutting trees, building ships. And now these are small ships that they can use on the lake. They disassemble all the ships. With their hundreds of allies now, they take the ships back to the shores of Tenochtitlan, reassemble the ships, load up the few cannons and the arquebuses that they have, row out into the water and start blasting the crap out of Tenochtitlan. And then they fight the people, they land and fight street by street until eventually the Aztecs finally surrender. One of the things which prompted the Aztecs to surrender is that there was an outbreak of smallpox that was affecting everyone there during that time, but the Aztecs, they did not have immunity to that, so they got hit a little bit worse. So even though they had an estimated population of 1 million people, they just couldn't keep up the fight over that period of time. After that happened, parts of the city were destroyed, the lake was drained, stuff was being rebuilt. Cortez was magnanimous in his victory, and he built a hospital and he built some other things. So he wasn't totally horrible. And then Tenochtitlan became Mexico City, and that was the capital of the colony of New Spain. Now, a second cousin of his was Francisco Pizarro. So just 5 years after this happened, Pizarro, who was in Panama, wanted to go down exploring into South America, and he had permission to do that. He had one expedition. He didn't get too much out of it, encountered some natives that had some gold trinkets. He lost some men for fighting, illness, etc. Turns around and goes back. A couple of years later, he goes out again. This is even worse. He's having heavy losses. His men are not happy. It's a brutal place to be in. But he finds some new people, and these happen to be Incas, and they have even more gold, and they tell him stories about where all this gold is. So his curiosity is piqued. His men are extremely unhappy because they're out there for a long time. They're getting nothing out of this. And the supply ship comes to pick all these guys up. They said, "You guys got to come back now. You're farting around out here in the jungle." Pizarro says, "Look, I'm going to draw a line in the sand. I'm going on. I'm not going back. If you want to come with me, come across this line." Only 13 of the men stayed with him. Everyone else went back. He went further into the jungle. He met some other people who were associated with the Incas. He didn't lose any of the other men. He was there for a few months, and eventually another ship came back and grabbed him and took him back. Now, the governor says, "You're not doing that anymore." But Pizarro had a different idea because he was so driven, he was so focused on what he wanted to do that nothing was going to stop him. So he sailed back to Spain a couple of years after that. He talked to the monarchs there, and they give him permission for another expedition. They gave him some funds for it, and they gave him governorship of part of South America on top of that. So 1 year after that, he sets sail for the third time. They do wind up running into the Incas finally. They have a big pitched battle. They defeat them. And after that battle, another conquistador by the name of Hernando de Soto, he shows up with his men, and he joins forces with Pizarro. They move further inland until they finally get to the capital city of Cajamarca, and their leader is Atahualpa. At this time, they've got a little over 100 infantry, about 60 cavalry. They've got 3 rifles and a couple of cannons, and then that's it. To make the long story a little bit shorter, There's uneasy tensions, just like there was up in Tenochtitlan, because these Incas, they're not quite sure who these white guys are. Are these gods, or what are they doing? They're a little mean, and they're demanding that we load up these rooms with bars of silver and bars of gold so they can take it back. So there's an uneasy peace between these two camps, and the conquistadors, they're living among these people, because when the conquistadors went on these trips, they stayed out for years at a time. These weren't short little trips. They had to dedicate themselves to it. There was no fast transportation. So when De Soto and Pizarro are out scouting other areas of the Incan Empire one day, the conquistadors back in camp get upset with Atapuerco. They put him on trial and then they execute him, which again sets everyone off. A big battle kicks off. Pizarro and De Soto come back. They subjugate the people there, and they leave some of the people behind, and they head on out to the coast, and they set up a new place on the coast called Lima, which is now Lima, Peru. They didn't set up a station or mines, etc., inside the capital city there because it was too mountainous. It was too far away from the coast. Now, over time, if we fast forward another 30, 40 years, the Incas resisted this colonization. They resisted this rule until eventually, 40 years after this event happened that I talked about, conquistadors came back. They grabbed the ruler at that time and executed him, and then they brought that territory properly under the rule of Spain. So what Spain was doing in Central America and South America, they set up governorships, they set up mines, and they set up trains, donkey trains, that would take the gold and silver from the mines either to the east coast or the west coast of South America. They would be loaded on ships, and then all that treasure would be taken to Spain. So that was up and running. Now, if we look from the English point of view, if we go forward about 25 years after the events of Pizarro, there's a young man named Francis Drake. He also has a cousin known as Walter Raleigh that we'll get to. But Walter Raleigh, he was a bit of a fancy boy. He was more of a financier. He wasn't a navigator. But someone who was a navigator was Hawkins, a cousin of his. So they get a few ships, and they have the idea to be entrepreneurial. We want to get on the game and make some money. They pick up African slaves, and they're taking them over to a Spanish port in the New World. Now, there had already been a little bit of conflict between Spain and England at this time, but there wasn't the proper war that had broken out. But the Spanish ambushed these English ships, and they sink a couple of the ships, and they take some of the English seamen captive. Drake hightails it out of there. This is his first battle that he's been in. So he got a little bit of a bad reputation, deservedly so, because he left his cousin behind. But he hated the Spain ever since then, and he had a burning desire to get back at them. What he did is he put together fleets of small maneuverable ships, and he would pick off the heavily loaded Spanish galleons one at a time, unload all the gold and silver that he could possibly get, and then he would take it back to England. Queen Elizabeth tacitly gave him permission to do that. Officially, she would say, "Oh, no one's more surprised than I am. I can't believe he's doing that. I'm sorry, King Philip of Spain. I am embarrassed. I don't know what's going on." And then, good job, because he was helping to pay off the debts that Queen Elizabeth had accrued over time. And a couple of the things that Francis Drake did is sometimes he would go inland and he would ambush these silver trains, taking the silver out of the mines and trying to load them onto the ships. At one time, he absconded with so much silver that he had to bury some of it. He didn't have enough buoyancy on his ships to carry all that silver away. So that might be the genesis of buried treasure and pirate maps. Another thing that he did that made him quite famous was in 1577, he got the bright idea of not only attacking ships in the Caribbean, but going all the way around the tip of South America and up the west coast to where the mines and those Spanish galleons were undefended, completely undefended. So he was a terror over there and unloaded huge amounts of gold and silver. But he knew that he couldn't go back around the tip of South America, the Spanish would be waiting for him. So he was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. He just went on the whole way around until he got back to England. King Philip was extremely upset about this, and this was also at a time when England was trying to work with some diplomacy with Spain to quell the fighting, the angst that they had towards each other, as diplomacy does. It might be genuine or it might be duplicitous, but they were at least going through the motions. But this kind of blew that out of the water. And every time something would happen to a Spanish colony, like Drake would burn some of the colonies down, or Drake would steal some of the Spanish gold, or some of the other privateers would steal it, King Philip would become outraged, and Elizabeth would kind of, push him aside. One time though, Elizabeth did say, "Look, your Pope can't just say what you own. Your Pope doesn't own the New World here. And because you name a river or a town, or you put a flag over here, that doesn't mean that that belongs to you." So ultimately, it did come down to who had the power. And also, I think that England saw that as a way of waging war against Spain. They couldn't hit them straight on. It had to be more of what's the word? Where one side is much less powerful than the other one, so you don't fight them head on. More of like a guerrilla war. Now, the last person I want to talk about in this scenario is Walter Raleigh, who was a younger cousin of Francis Drake. He was not a navigator, but he fancied himself someone who belonged in the English court. He was well spoken, he was well dressed, and he wanted to get in on the action, and he financed privateer campaigns. So he financed these ships, and he reaped the rewards for that. And he was in the good graces of Queen Elizabeth. He wooed Queen Elizabeth. Whether there was a relationship or not there is difficult to tell. And that's up to the reader, or that's up to the person who's studying this. By fast forward to one of the significant battles of this ongoing war between England and France was the Battle of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Spain had been cutting down a tremendous amount of their trees to build this fleet. And I assume that they were doing that as well for their galleons to bring all the gold and silver back. And if you go to Spain now, modern Spain, most of their forests are gone. They haven't ever grown back because they don't have the rainfall that they used to. And they sacrificed all that to make this huge fleet. Unfortunately for them, England used their privateers. They used some fire ships to take out a lot of the Spanish fleet, the Armada, during that attack. And then the Spanish fleet had an unfortunate storm, and they tried to take a route going all the way up around the British Isles, Ireland, and then all the way back down. And it was a disaster for them. They couldn't have had worse luck. That didn't finish off the Spanish Empire, but that gave England a lot of breathing room. And also for people who were arguing, well, does God want Catholics or does God want Protestants? Well, God wants Protestants because God put the storm on the Catholics right there. It's simple. See how that works, guys? Now, Raleigh, since he was a fancy boy and he liked to get in on the action, from time to time, he would talk to some of the people in court along the lines of treasonous acts, where he was trying to angle some way where he could make some money, possibly by passing information along to King Philip of Spain, and he could get paid for that. Now, whether or not he was joking, whether or not he was pretending to be a double agent, or whether or not he was being serious, we don't know. But in time, this type of talk caught up with him. Now, whether or not there was a relationship between him and Elizabeth did like him. And what Walter Raleigh did in 1591 is he secretly married one of Elizabeth's ladies in waiting. He did not get permission for this. The lady in waiting did not get permission for this. And probably what happened is the lady in waiting, her name was Bess Throckmorton, she became pregnant, and then they married a couple months after that. Elizabeth gave them time to come forward and, say what they had done. They didn't do that. She got irate. She put him in the Tower of London, and then she put her in the Tower of London. And they stayed in the Tower of London until a time happened when some of the privateer ships that Raleigh owned had come back loaded down with Spanish gold and silver. And before that could get unloaded and taken to the proper authorities, people who had worked with Raleigh, mariners, they helped themselves to all of this gold and silver, and they absconded with it. And authorities from the court went to the private houses of these people and said, hey, you got to give us all this gold back. That's not yours. And the mariner said, nope, you ain't getting it. Elizabeth realized that the only person who could command these people to give the gold back was Raleigh. She let Raleigh out. He did that. They got the gold back. It went on to Elizabeth and the government. And then Elizabeth put Walter Raleigh, Fancy Pants Walter Raleigh, and his wife under house arrest at their place in Dorset. Eventually, he was allowed to have freedom once again, and he decided to sail to the Americas because he wanted to find El Dorado. He went up the Orinoco River and he didn't find El Dorado. He turned around after a month and he came back. Now, a few years after this, Elizabeth dies. A year after that, that war with Spain officially ends. And Raleigh's talking about treason once again. He's talking about treason against King James I. He probably wasn't as enamored with King James as he was with Elizabeth. Raleigh gets arrested, put on trial, convicted. You need to be drawn and quartered. Now, only King James can say, okay, we're going to do the execution now, but King James didn't do that. He put him in jail, and he stayed in jail for 12 years. The result of all of this was that eventually Raleigh pulled one more stunt like that. He went to the Americas, he came back, he was arrested once again, and he was executed. And England's naval capabilities, because of all the privateer work that had been done, had advanced them to the point where they could hold their own against Spain, and they could begin to focus on colonizing the New World if they wanted to as well.
All right, so now we are on to the more information on the political climate in Europe as it connects to the New World and the exploration measures. We're going to have a nice brisk walk through this, so we have some time for the other presentations. But Jim and J-Play, whichever of you wants to go first, let's hear it, and let's be mindful to the clock.
Actually, Luther is going to go first, and he's going to go over his namesake, Martin Luther, and I will be following him, and then Jim will take it over, from my understanding.
Very good. Let's do that then.
All right, sounds good. So I'm pretty much just going to be focusing on Martin Luther's early escapades in the Reformation. So from about 1517 to 1555, wrapping up with the Peace of Augsburg. So in 1517, Martin Luther famously nails his theses to the door of Castle Church in Wittenberg. This is him protesting the use of indulgences by the Catholic Church at the time. The indulgence, for those who don't know, it's a permit, essentially reducing the duration of one's suffering in purgatory before being allowed to go on to heaven. So he, being a professor of theology at this time, is hoping to get everybody's attention and get this addressed. The political story, that's the theological background gist of it, but the political story has more to do with the power that the Holy Roman Empire has, and the Pope specifically holds unilaterally over the whole empire. Pope Leo X is the Pope at this time. He's personally trying to renovate Rome, and he's hoping to raise money through the sale of indulgences. So that's why the indulgences become an issue at all. The Roman Catholic Church at this time controls or owns 30 to 50% of all the land in Europe. So the additional fleecing of people on their poor suffering mother in purgatory is a little much, and certainly provokes Luther to go ahead and get these issues addressed. Luther is an ordained Catholic priest at the time. Like I mentioned, he's also a professor of biblical theology. He's a preacher, and he's also a district vicar of the Augustinian order. So he pretty much oversees 11 monasteries. He's not just some side character in this. He's wanting to draw the Pope's attention to hopefully get these theological issues addressed. He posts the theses. Nobody's really interested in debating. And then, unbeknownst to him, utilizing the printing press, people begin churning out this theses, and it just spreads all over the place, and it starts causing a stir, getting everybody's attention. Most notably, princes, electors, and other political figures start to notice, hey, that's this could be interesting. So he's certainly gotten everybody's attention. He eventually gets the Pope's attention, but the Pope isn't so much interested in the theological debate as he is like, hey, who's this guy directly calling out my power? So he calls Luther to be questioned in Rome. Luther's extradition is blocked by Frederick the Wise, who's the Elector of Saxony at this time. He's concerned about Luther's safety. He's afraid if he goes to Rome and is questioned and they don't like what they hear, that he's not going to come back. So they renegotiate that the hearing is to take place in Augsburg, Germany, a little closer to home. Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, he's one of 7 electors. So a little background into the power structure of Rome. There were 7 electors that would vote on electing or nominating, rather, what was referred to as the King of Romans. And then it was the Pope, of course, who would have the final say and then crown the King of Romans as the Holy Roman Emperor over the whole empire itself. So this is not just theological tension at the time, but it's also political tension building. And the Elector Frederick is wise enough to see that this is more. So he's kind of keeping an eye on Luther and does what he can to keep him alive until things play out. Luther ends up walking like over 800 miles down to Augsburg. He doesn't have a horse. He doesn't have anything. So he just waltzes down to Augsburg to meet with this fella who's a renowned theologian at the time, this Bishop Cajetan. He wants Luther to recant. He wants him to vow to not contradict the church any longer. Luther refuses to recant without being convinced from Scripture or by clear reason. And this is really where the real argument emerges. And the real topic is papal authority versus scriptural authority. Luther is essentially implicitly denying that the popes and councils have authority over Scripture. The bishop is pissed, to say the least. He writes like a ton of letters to Frederick the Wise demanding that Luther be sent to Rome or at least exiled from Saxony. And Frederick writes back and refuses, using the same exact argument and same reasoning as Luther, reaffirming that Luther has not been refuted by Scripture. And this is really the point of no return for the Reformation. The full argument has now been presented, and the lines are essentially drawn. And it touches on this issue that ends up influencing the founding of America later on in some of the early colonies. This is popes versus emperors. This is essentially where we get the origins of separation of church and state. So a little bit of background as far as the doctrine that the Holy Roman Empire is under at this time that justifies this unilateral, universal power that the Pope has. The doctrine is called the Two Swords Doctrine, and the idea is that God gives 2 powers or 2 swords to the Pope. One is the spiritual sword, overseeing spiritual things, and the other is a temporal sword, overseeing the temporal world. The spiritual sword is meant to be wielded by the Pope, and the temporal sword is meant to be wielded by kings and emperors, but only as a delegated power from the Pope. So the Pope essentially has all of this power. He just kind of ceremoniously gives it over to the emperor. This doctrine is the strongest claim that the Catholic Church has to this universal authority in the empire at the time. This is eventually replaced, but it is opposed with this, or refined, I should say, 2 kingdoms doctrine, which Luther puts together. So similar idea to the 2 swords. You've got these two segments, these 2 realms or categories, but rather than swords, they're different kingdoms, they're different realms. And the idea is that God rules the entire world, not the Pope, but he does so through the spiritual kingdom as well as the temporal kingdom. He rules the spiritual kingdom via the church and the gospel, and then he rules the temporal kingdom via nature and natural law. So both are very crucial, both are needed, and a lot of this is the refining of these categories that we end up seeing playing a huge role in the founding. A couple of the duties of the spiritual kingdom: preaching the word, administering the sacraments, salvation of souls, forgiveness of sins, things pertaining to that. The temporal kingdom is God ruling through natural law. So this is reason, ruling with the sword, so positive law. This is the civil magistrate. Preservation of peace, order in the world, protecting the good and punishing the evil. This is the civil ruler. The Pope obviously doesn't want to lose power, and the emperor wants to keep his empire together. So they're both on the same page, and they both agree that a unified religion for the empire is going to achieve those things. So it just puts an even larger target on Luther. The Pope then excommunicates Luther in 1520. The people appeal to the emperor, and Charles calls for the Diet of Worms in 1521. So they're going to put him to the question again, and he's ordered, they have all Luther's works laid out. He is ordered to burn his works and recant. And this is where we get Luther's famous "Here I stand" statement, where he refuses. He's like, unless I can be proven wrong by scripture or by plain reason, then I need to let my position rest where it is. Emperor Charles signs the Edict of Worms, which declares Luther an outlaw at this time. So Luther can now be lawfully murdered at any time, but to save face, the emperor gives him a couple of days head start to go and run. As he is headed back home, Luther is kidnapped, and this is Frederick the Wise who's behind his kidnapping again. He stows him away in Wartburg Castle, so he's kept safe from the general public as he is now an outlaw. This is where Luther gets a lot of his writing done, where he translates the New Testament into German, and he actually ends up writing like a quarter of all the books in Europe at this time. Some of these writings also challenge the power in Europe in other ways. So he elevates the common man and dignifies the simple laborer, which is a pretty unique idea at that time. So throughout his writings, he ends up describing this new idea of thinking of Christians within the nation, and allows them also to have a place of honor in the fabric of the nation. No matter how mundane their occupation is or how menial their work, they can do what they do to the glory of God and to the benefit of their neighbor, which is a pretty unique idea at that time, and certainly something that we see echoed in the founding later. So popes, bishops, and nuns are no longer above anybody else. This is all now even across the board. In 1529, we have the Marburg Colloquy, and this is where Lutheranism and the Reform between Luther and Zwingli, they disagree on the nature of the Lord's Supper, and these two theologies take a divergence here, and where you end up with Lutherans as well as the Reformed. In 1530, they present the Augsburg Confession, and this is the first major Lutheran confession which delineates all of their particular beliefs, citing scripture, which is helpful and needed at that time, because other than that, it's just a bunch of loose leaf writing. So now we're getting into like actual documents that are putting forth legitimate arguments that need to be responded to in kind. Luther ends up dying in 1546 of like a stroke is what they end up believing it is. And a year later, the Schmalkaldic War in 1547 kicks off. The Schmalkaldic League is just this league of Lutheran princes that are like, okay, we're going to band together against the church, and we're going to be in league together. Charles ends up defeating them. He's victorious and ends up dissolving the league and ends up imposing the Augsburg Interim. So he's like, okay, Reformation is canceled, and you're all not going to be Catholic again. What's interesting that leads out of this is that, there's only one imperial city, which is Magdeburg, that ends up refusing to submit to this interim. They end up publishing the Magdeburg Confession and the Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates, which essentially lays out a framework for how Christians ought to resist tyranny. All of this language is echoed in the Declaration of Independence, and after you go through and look at this, it's readily apparent. Samuel Adams ends up quoting it as well at that time, so it's certainly playing a role and it's influencing the founders. They break it down. A lot of it's based on Romans chapter 13, which lays out what a good ruler is in the Bible. Essentially, a good ruler protects the good and punishes the evil. rather than burning down your entire state, your entire society because of some slight or transient infraction, they have delineated 4 different degrees, kind of as a framework that Christians can go by when it comes to assessing whether or not you do have a good ruler and what you ought to be doing depending on some of their behavior. So to briefly run through some of that, the first degree, these are a ruler that occasionally commands evil or forbids good. Still a legitimate ruler, and they're not doing anything that is warranting revolt or resistance at this time. Second degree, you've got clear intention and plans to destroy or oppress. They threaten the populace, they institute evil laws, etc. And they are now suspected of tyranny. The lower magistrates should be preparing defenses and issuing warnings to the people. The third degree, they've begun to openly persecute folks using force, imprisonment, suppression, and this is now where the ruler is titled a tyrant in act. And the lower magistrates are to actively resist as well as defend the people. And fourth degree is fully established lasting tyranny. This is systematic persecution, long-term, and destruction of the legal order. And that's where they say everybody, the magistrates as well as the citizens, should be resisting. Shortly after that, there's a second Schmalkaldic War where Emperor Charles is betrayed and the emperor ends up yielding and they have a temporary peace, like, okay, Lutheranism, Protestantism is going to be a thing now. And then shortly after that, in 1555, the actual Peace of Augsburg is signed and agreed upon, where the Pope himself essentially relinquishes his position and admits, like, okay, we now have a different form of Christianity in the lands.
Great explanation from Luther on Martin Luther and the general Protestant Reformation. That's very important in the political climate of Europe. And of course, the political climate and the religious climate at this time period is essentially the same. And Luther did a good job at explaining those concepts as well. But while he went over Martin Luther's life, I'm going to do more of a zoom out and why it makes sense for European powers to do something as risky as building little wooden forts on the edge of a continent they barely understand with a bunch of savages trying to kill them. So, just to keep it tight, I'm going to try to frame it around 5 big ideas. The first is that Spain and Portugal are acting like the Atlantic world already belongs to them. Right after Columbus, you get this mindset that the non-European world can be claimed under divine and legal authority. In 1493, the Pope issues a papal bull called Inter Caetera, which basically grants Spain a right to claim and evangelize newly found Western lands. Then Spain and Portugal make it concrete with the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which draws a line down the map that essentially says west of this line is Spain's zone and east of this line is Portugal's zone. And then that kind of lines up with modern day Brazil and the rest of Latin America, not exactly. But in their minds, in the minds of a lot of European elites, the world outside of Europe is basically divided between 2 crowns. And that matters because the English and the Dutch are late entrants. And when they're looking across the Atlantic, they're looking on a globe that's already carved up by the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, the second big idea, and this is massive, and Eric already went over it before, and another host, is that it's the printing press. This changes the entire game of Europe. When Gutenberg's printing technology spreads across Europe, it doesn't just produce more books, it produces a new kind of society, one where ideas can move fast and widely and cheaply. And the single most explosive consequence, especially for religion, which is the same as politics this time, is that the Bible goes from being mostly mediated through clergy to being physically accessible by individuals. So more and more through vernacular translations and printed copies that can circulate beyond monasteries and universities. And not everyone can read, and books cost money, but even with those limits, the printing press does 2 things that matter for our story. It puts scripture into broader circulation, and it creates an early mass media political battlefield because the printing press creates kind of pamphlet warfare, not just theology, but propaganda. And to think about what that means politically, rulers and reformers, they can now shape public opinion, and rival states can amplify scandal materials. They can give atrocity propaganda, sermons, and manifestos. So the printing press doesn't just help Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation, it creates an entire ecosystem where religious conflict spreads faster, political allegiance becomes tied to religious identity, and Europe becomes a continent where ideas can ignite entire religions. And once Europe becomes an information war, the Atlantic becomes another theater for that information war. Now, the third big idea is that anti Spanish politics, which later historians called the Black Legend, once Europe fractures along those religious lines, Spain isn't just the richest imperial power, it's also the chief Catholic enforcer in the Protestant eyes. And that's where the printing culture matters because texts can be translated and mass produced and circulated as political weapons. And two kinds of sources can get weaponized. On one hand, you have the Spanish legal religious conquest logic, things like the Requerimiento, a declaration that essentially tells native people, we come under the authority of the Pope and the Spanish crown, submit, we're justified in making war because of that. And then you have the Bartolome de las Casas, who was a Spanish friar, who writes a moral critique on Spanish royalty, and he attacks abuses from inside the Spanish world. And Spain's rivals love this in the Protestant world because it's ammunition for them. So Protestants in Northern Europe can translate and circulate his materials and build an image of Spain as a tyrant and bloodthirsty in its imperial model. Now, why that's useful is because that allows the English and the Dutch, our ancestors, to pitch their own Atlantic actions as morally justified. So the Black Legend becomes political PR and a moral story that helps justify Spain's monopoly, why Spain's monopoly should be broken. A fourth big idea is the Dutch Revolt and a new kind of Protestant statecraft. In the late 1500s, the Netherlands, under the Habsburg Empire, under Philip II of Spain, over the course of the 80 Years' War, the Dutch staged a long, grinding, successful revolt. And their case is very influential because of three reasons. Number one is explicitly religious and political, because many of the Dutch provinces are Reformed and Calvinist, and I'm going to explain Calvinism in the religious section later. Second is that they put radical ideas into writing. So you get the Union of Utrecht, which binds provinces together. And you have the Act of Abjuration, which basically is a formal statement that a ruler who behaves like a tyrant can be lawfully rejected, which goes into our own American history later on. And the third idea is that they become a commercial sea power. The Dutch don't just rebel and survive, they become a trading powerhouse. They build companies and fleets with global reach. So England is just watching a living example right across the channel, a Protestant commercial state that is seafaring, that defies Spain, and that gives England a model of how to combine religion, trade, and naval power as a justification to plant these new colonies. Now, my fifth and final idea, there's France's instability in the same period. Because from 1562 to 1598, France is torn up by the French wars of religion, like is going on in Germany with Martin Luther, which Luther went over before. But this is Catholics against the Huguenots, and the Huguenots are not named after John Calvin like the Calvinists are. In fact, there's no Calvinist branch. I'll go over Calvinism later, but with the Huguenots, who are Calvinists, not Lutheran, you get civil war, shifting alliances, and atrocities like the St. Bartholomew Day massacre. But for our purposes, two things basically matter. If you want Exhibit A for Europe as a pressure cooker, it's France, because it's a major kingdom that's shredding itself over religion and legitimacy. The other thing is that it's a kingdom busy trying not to collapse at home. It's going to project consistent power abroad, and that creates opportunity, and that gives more space in the Atlantic for the English and the Dutch to maneuver. And even after the Edict of Nantes in 1598, France's settlement is fragile. It's not a permanent cure. So, heading into 1607, you have a Europe where Spain is dominant and claims the Atlantic. You have northern Protestants who are morally and politically mobilized against the Spanish Catholic Empire. The Dutch demonstrate successful maritime resistance. France is unstable, and the printing press is accelerating every conflict by turning ideas into fast moving weapons. In closing, I'm going to hand it off to Jim, who's going to go over the pre Westphalian order and explain that.
Yeah, and I can kind of zoom out in the interest of time and look at it more so from 30,000 feet. So you're going to hear very commonly a distinction of the state before and after the Peace of Westphalia. If this is something that interests you, listen to or read William Lind. Eric recently had a very nice discussion with Mike from Imperium Press. I've done some work on it. It's in my pinned tweet. But essentially, the Peace of Westphalia is a nice, clean marking point to denote the transition from more decentralized power, decentralized statehood, people giving their primary allegiance not to the state, but to other organizations, whether it be religious, political, criminal, so on and so forth. And post Westphalia, they start to consolidate power into a centralized bureaucracy, centralized state. And what ends up happening is we come to the present day where the state has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. While that is a clean mark, that doesn't mean that somebody waved a magic wand and the whole order changed overnight as a result of this treaty. As with everything, there's an ebb and flow. They blend into each other, mix and mingle. But we can broadly say that the why behind colonization that we'll eventually see in the New World is linked to the tumultuous state of early modern Europe. This will culminate in the era defined by the 30 Years' War that ends in the Peace of Westphalia. It creates this fundamental shift in the logic of statecraft. So pre-Westphalia, Europe is, we have to understand as we're starting to talk about colonization, that Europe is a patchwork of weak, decentralized polities where political legitimacy is deeply entwined with religious confession and dynastic right. We've mentioned the Peace of Augsburg and the principle of his realm, his religion. We can talk a little bit about Calvinism and persistent dynastic conflicts that erupted or caused the 30 Years' War to erupt. But you just have to understand from the context of people who lived at this period of time just how impactful these wars of religion were, just how devastating they were, to the point where I truly believe that this left a genetic imprint on our people. Roughly 20 to 30%. By the end of this, by the time Westphalia is signed, an estimated 20 to 30% of the Holy Roman Empire is dead. There's localized devastation of up to 50%. There's a fundamental crisis of political and religious authority that served as a profound demographic and psychological selection event for European society. Pre-Westphalia, we see motives for exploration of the New World being monarchs who are deriving their legitimacy from God and the papacy or divine right. Saw overseas expansion as an extension of the continent-wide religious struggle at the time. Colonies are outposts for the conversion of native populations and strategic moves against rival confessions. On an individual level, why might an individual pre-Westphalia look to go to the New World? Well, religious persecution and endemic violence is a powerful push factor. Again, conceptualize how devastating 50% depopulation in a certain region would be. If we had a singular battle in this day and age that resulted in 10% casualties, it would be looked on as a bloodbath, not to say anything of population displacement. And currently, there's economic pressures that we will see, particularly in England, like primogeniture. Primogeniture being the transition of family wealth to the firstborn son, particularly land. Given the land scarcity in England, that's going to be a powerful push factor pre-Westphalia as well, and post-Westphalia. After the Peace of Westphalia, it sort of enshrines the modern principle of state sovereignty and legal equality among the states. Conflicts start to get a lot more secular. Right around this time is where you see interesting things happening, like Protestant states going to war with one another, or, Catholics aligning with Muslim Ottomans to go to war with other Catholics. That happened right in this period of time, in the transition period. But The shift to state sovereignty has a profound impact on colonial rationale. State motives now transition away from a religious undertaking to a tool of secular state policy, projection of power, mercantilist competition. So at this point in time, we also have to understand, which we'll touch on in the economics section, that state power is directly linked to the amount of hard cash assets you have on hand, particularly gold and silver. Territory becomes a strategic asset. Raw materials are now a strategic asset, which constitute national wealth. Individually, religious freedom still remains a factor, particularly for sects like the Quakers. But the predominant pull will start to become economic opportunity. And we'll see this in some of the early failures of colonization of the New World as well in North America. This becomes institutionalized through systems like indentured servitude, which grant the poor the ability to have their passage paid for in exchange for a certain number of years of labor for their transatlantic passage. Religion is increasingly subordinated to the state. Alliances now blatantly cross confessional lines. We talked a little bit more about that, and I think that sums up the portion that I had put together. So
We're going to be going into English history, and I'm going to go over it with
Right.
Luke. We're going to go over 5 monarchs: Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary the First, otherwise known as Bloody Mary, and then Queen Elizabeth and King James. And this kind of explains that era before Jamestown, named after King James. So, just to understand why England ends up doing what it does in the Atlantic and why it's willing to pick fights with Spain and why it frames colonization in religious language and why it becomes so obsessed with national sovereignty, you really have to understand one domestic earthquake that really reshaped the entire kingdom. And that's when England breaks with Rome. And that break didn't just happen as a calm philosophical reform, as it never has. It was very messy with a high stakes power struggle over dynasty and legitimacy and authority. And it leaves England with decades of religious whiplash. It's the exact kind of pressure cooker environment that makes the New World look like both an opportunity and a strategic necessity. Now, Henry VIII goes from the defender of the faith to the supreme head of the church in the split. When he comes to the throne in 1509, he's not a rebel against Catholic Europe, actually, because the early Henry is very much inside of Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, the Pope, sacraments, all the whole medieval framework, and did not support Protestantism at all. In fact, he even earned the title Defender of the Faith for attacking Martin Luther's ideas in print. So, what changed? And this is historical opinion. Of course, he would never frame it this way himself. Henry marries Catherine of Aragon, and after years of marriage, England still does not have a male heir that Henry wants. And Catherine only produces a surviving daughter named Mary, who becomes queen later on, but no surviving son. And Henry becomes convinced, or he persuades himself, that the marriage is cursed and must be annulled. And here's the problem, because in the old Catholic order, the Pope has to approve of an annulment. And the Pope in this moment, who's Clement the Seventh, is trapped in the politics of Europe with Martin Luther and John Calvin. And Catherine of Aragon's nephew is Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and one of the most powerful men in Europe. So for the Pope, granting Henry's divorce would be more than just a spiritual decision. It would be a direct political insult to the entire Habsburg Empire. So Henry gets blocked, and this is the first major point. You can almost see the light bulb go on. If Rome can veto England's dynastic future, then England's sovereignty is not really sovereign. And that's the core political revolution that's hiding inside that marriage drama. Now, Henry tries initially to solve this through his top minister, Cardinal Wolsey, but Wolsey fails to secure the annulment and falls from power. Then Henry pivots to a more radical strategy, and instead of asking Rome for permission, England just redefines who has authority. So Parliament becomes the machine that makes this legal, actually, because the key move is essentially no more appeals to Rome. So, in other words, the highest authority in England on English matters will be the English crown, who's the new head of the church, not the Pope. So by 1533, Henry's marriage to Catherine is effectively declared invalid within the English system, and Henry marries Anne Boleyn. Then in 1534 comes the explosive centerpiece, the Act of Supremacy, which declares the king the supreme head of the Church of England. And this is not just we prefer Protestant theology. This is a declaration that England is a separate religious political unit, a national church under a national monarch, inspired by the Protestant Reformation without the ideas of it. And that shift matters for everything that comes later because England learns to think in terms of national identity and a national church and a national power. And once that break happens, Henry can't stop at the paperwork. He uses his new authority to seize a very enormous chunk of institutional power. And then he dissolves the monasteries. The monasteries weren't just religious sites, they're major land holders and economic engines. And when Henry dissolves them, their land and wealth gets redistributed, usually to the nobles and the gentry who have a material stake. And that creates a new kind of political ratchet because once the elites benefit from the new church settlement, it becomes harder to reverse that without threatening their property. And the dissolution also creates just resentment and an arrest, like the Pilgrimage of Grace, which is a northern rebellion that shows how divided England is becoming. So under Henry, you get a kingdom that is consolidating royal authority, detaching from the Roman Catholic Church, and is very willing to use state power to enforce religious settlement as the new head of Christianity in England. So one important clarification, Henry's break with Rome does not automatically mean England becomes Protestant. Henry, he's still conservative on the actual theology of Rome. So the split is just transitional, and it leads to this unstable middle period where he's rejected papal infallibility and the Pope's authority, but he's not really settled on theology and a clear identity that everyone agrees on, and that's where you get the Puritans, which I will get into in the religious section later. But after Henry VIII, we get Henry VIII's male heir, Edward the Sixth, born to Jane Seymour, his third wife. Actually, he had many wives because he was constantly trying to make a male heir. And Henry dies in 1547, and Edward becomes king as a child, and that means that the real power moves to regents, not child, of course. So first Somerset and later Northumberland, and the religious direction of England shifts. Under Edward, England moves into much more explicitly Protestant reforms in theology and strips back on that Catholic ritual and imagery and clergy practice. And the political point here is that religion is now tied to whoever controls the state apparatus. So under Henry, England breaks with Rome, and under Edward, England becomes to look more like Protestant kingdom. But Edward does not live long. He dies in 1553, reigns for only about 7 years as a child. And then there is no more male heir. So power goes to the first queen of England, who's known as Mary, otherwise known as Bloody Mary. So if you're ever at a bar and you see a Bloody Mary drink, you'll know where the legend and that whole thing comes from, because Mary was bloody. And because Edward's government fears a Catholic restoration, a plan forms to bypass Henry's daughter Mary, actually, and instead put Lady Jane Grey on the throne. And Jane is proclaimed queen briefly, but the move collapses because Mary has a strong claim and very strong support from Rome. And that's when the pendulum swings hard in Mary's direction, and Mary inherits the entire country that has already been jerked through Catholic unity, a national church under Henry, and Protestant reforms under Edward. So now Mary's mission is restoration. She's Catholic. She wants to bring England back under the Pope and back inside Catholicism. She repeals the Protestant reforms. But politically, Mary's reign becomes defined by one issue that terrifies a large part of England, is that Mary marries Philip of Spain, Philip II, who is one of the most powerful Catholic rulers on the earth. And for many English elites, that looked like a nightmare scenario because England is now subordinate to the Spanish Catholic superpower. And that sparks very intense resistance and paranoia. There was Wyatt's Rebellion in 1554, major uprising tied to fears over that Spanish marriage. And Mary survives it, but the distrust hardens. And now comes a part of her reign where she earns Bloody Mary in the Protestant memory because of her persecution of the Protestants. Her government burns prominent Protestants, leaders, clergies, and public leaders, and it's meant to restore the religious unity of Catholicism through fear and enforcement. One of the most famous martyrdoms are people like Thomas Cranmer, who actually crafts the theology of the modern day Church of England, and bishops like Ridley and Latimer. You can read about them in Fox's Book of Martyrs. And whether you see these actions as informants of unity or tyranny, the effect is political, and it kind of tattoos England with an intense emotional association between Catholic restoration, state violence, and fear of foreign domination, especially Spanish domination. And Mary's reign also suffers major blows because she experiences false pregnancies, which undermines hopes of a Catholic heir. And England becomes entangled in a war and loses Calais, which is England's last foothold in France, which is strategic humiliation for England. Now, Mary dies in 1558 childless, and then another daughter of Henry VIII takes over, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so what you're going to find with the cases of Elizabeth and James, who comes after her, is it's a religious war. Whether it was metaphysical or it was realized, their ambitions with exploration, in the case of Elizabeth, and colonization, with the case of James, they were primarily religious, especially in the case of James. And we'll get into that in a bit. But primarily, we'll be diving into their motivations, their childhoods, their personal lives, the conditioning that they underwent that caused their religious crusades into the New World, because we're going to be doing Jamestown in the next one. It would go on to forge America. So Elizabeth was a believer in the primacy of Protestant Christianity, and she was of a similar potency in her faith to her half sister Mary, who we just talked about, who was Catholic. So when Mary was in power in England, she threw Elizabeth in jail in the Tower of London for a short time. And that was because she suspected Elizabeth was involved in Wyatt's rebellion. And obviously, like you just heard, since Wyatt's rebellion was carried out due to fear of foreign influence, because Philip was married to Mary, that was a problem for her. So Mary dies in 1558. We don't know the illness really. It was an illness. And then the throne passes to Elizabeth. She's paranoid, she's contemptuous, she's distrusting of Catholics and their influence in England due to what happened to her under Mary. Since she'd been legitimized, though, and she ascended to the throne, and since her half sister died childless, she inherited complete bedlam. England was at war with France. Percentage of the nation didn't even think she was legitimate. English Catholics hated English Protestants. The English treasury was effectively bankrupt, as expected. It only reinforced her negative view of the Catholics. So, from a Protestant perspective, the ills of the nation were seemingly caused by them, by the Catholics. So, that corrupted her view of the Catholics even further, along with how her sister treated her. So, 1 year after the coronation, she carries this fervor of hers into law. She enshrines herself as like the supreme governor of the Church of England. She mandates the Book of Common Prayer. And this new Church of England, which she attempted to coagulate all of England's Christians into to reduce the rampant sectarianism, would go on to become the Anglican Church. So the Pope at the time, Pius V, he decrees Elizabeth a heretic. He says, every Catholic in England disregard her crown. Do not be loyal to her. He tries to depose her as well. So, because of that, she says, no, I'm not marrying Philip II because Spain's Catholic. And actually, due to this fact, England was effectively locked in a chronic ideological conflict with Spain. It was English Protestant power versus Spanish Catholic power projection. And expansion into the West was looked at by Elizabeth as one of the primary methods for securing that Protestant power. If Protestantism could spread, establish itself in the Americas, it would be a bastion against Spanish Catholic expansion. So, in many ways, the race for land and power in the New World was a metaphysical conflict. It was a religious struggle. It was yet another extension of Elizabeth's anti Catholic fervor, which she accumulated throughout her life. So, she's a Protestant crusader of sorts. This conviction of hers is something she was vocal about. So in 1559, in the Act of Supremacy, she says, "No foreign prince, person, prelate, state, or continent hath or ought to have any jurisdiction, power, superiority, preeminence, or authority, ecclesiastical or spiritual, within this realm." She writes a letter to a bishop in the first year she was queen, and she said, "We will not have Romish religion in England." She branded Catholics. In the interest of time, I'll gloss over a few of the quotes, but she branded Catholics enemies of God outright in the Tilbury speech. Additionally, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed. That was celebrated by English Catholics in the royal court. Mary also forced Elizabeth to go to mass when Mary was alive, forced her to renounce her Protestantism. A lot of Elizabeth's friends were tortured, thrown in jail, killed by Mary, called heretics, and that's why she's called Bloody Mary. And Elizabeth was actually excommunicated completely in 1570. So she was threatened by Catholic plots. This was while she was queen. Ridolfi, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington plot. Spain and the Roman papacy spent decades trying to have her dethroned and replaced by Mary, Queen of the Scots, and her life was threatened constantly. As a child, also, she was trained on Protestant Christianity. So, at the hands of Catherine Parr, Roger Ascham, other Protestants in the court, and obviously Henry rejected papal authority. So, for Elizabeth, it was a lifelong struggle. Success in England was like directly correlated with her personal safety and Protestantism. So that's why she needed it to succeed.
So I just wanted to interpose here because it's crucial to understand as we start to set the stage for the founding of the United States and the colonization of the New World, the importance of the joint stock company as an organizational vehicle for exploration and colonization of the New World. So you're probably familiar, if you've ever been through a high school history class, of the most famous of these, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, the Dutch West India Company. What you have to understand is that ventures to the New World were extremely risky. There was colossal capital outlay. There was administrative complexity that you would not believe required for transoceanic adventures. What this joint stock company allowed for was for the sale of tradable shares for these expeditions. So it effectively privatized the early modern project of empire, allowing states to project power, claim territory without immediately bearing the full financial or bureaucratic burden. So while the relatively centralized Spanish and Portuguese crowns could initially finance and control exploration directly through state institutions, Northern European states, the Netherlands, England, often more financially constrained, politically fragmented, facing well-established Iberian monopoly, adopted a more corporate franchise-like model. So what this did is allowed for the private pooling of capital through public or private sale of transferable shares. It aggregated funds on a broad base. This created a war chest far exceeding the resources that these northern European states had at the time. This also limited liability for these more cash-poor states. You can only lose whatever it is you invest. It also, more importantly, delegates sovereignty and administrative capacity, which again ties back into the Westphalian order thing. But early modern states, particularly England and the Dutch Republic, lacked extensive professional bureaucracies. They didn't have dedicated state-controlled navies in the way that we would understand them to administer distant territories. So these joint stock companies now get quasi-state powers, so they can actually wage war and make peace. India was famously not conquered by the British Empire as we understand it, but the British East India Company. They maintain private armies and navies that are much larger than the standing armies of countries in Europe. They attack competitors, they negotiate formal treaties, they govern territory and people. In fact, the Virginia Company and the establishment of the Virginia Company will lead directly to the foundation of colonies in North America. So they have ton of economic sovereignty as well. They hold monopoly rights over trade in a defined region. They actually, in some instances, mint their own money. They're collecting taxes and customs dues, that sort of thing. So another important thing is they have a degree of operational flexibility because they exist forever. They're not tied to one individual. And that about sums up the gist of what you would need to know to fully understand the context in which Jamestown will be founded.
Imagine the coastline of Florida, not with tourist-packed beaches, highways, or hotels, but as a raw, dangerous frontier. Storms rolling off the Atlantic, mosquitoes thick as smoke. Not a friendly port in sight. And yet, in this harsh, unforgiving place, Europe fought its first great battle for a foothold in what would become the United States. Today, I'm taking you on a rapid-fire journey through the birth of the oldest continuously inhabited European city in the continental US, St. Augustine, Florida. So why does St. Augustine matter? Because it endured. It survived hurricanes, starvation, fire, pirate raids, French attacks, English attacks, and internal turmoil. It survived when every earlier attempt had failed. It became Spain's gateway, its fortress, and a symbol of power for 200 years, and remains the oldest continuously inhabited European-founded city in the continental US. St. Augustine stands today not just as a historic town, but as a place where Europe's story in North America truly gained its first permanent foothold. But our story begins long before St. Augustine succeeds, with a series of failures. Ponce de Leon arrives in Florida in 1513. He returns later in 1521, and he's wounded in a clash with some local warriors. Then comes Panfilio de Narvaez in 1528 with 300 men. Within months, almost all of them, including Narvaez himself, are dead, swept away by storms, hunger, and conflict. Only 4 survivors, including Cabeza de Vaca, make it out after walking across the entire Gulf Coast. Next, Tristan de Luna attempts to establish a colony near Pensacola in 1559, but a hurricane destroys his supply ships, and the colony collapses in months. Florida, from Europe's perspective, is a deadly place, but Spain isn't done. There were several reasons why Spain was in the New World, but one big reason was money. Spain's treasure fleets, loaded with silver and gold from the New World, sail right past Florida as they catch the Gulf Stream northward. And who's waiting to rob them there? French privateers, English privateers, anyone with a fast ship and a sharp cutlass. Spain realizes if you want to protect the treasure fleet, you must control Florida. They don't need a fountain of youth. They don't need paradise. They need a fortress. Enter Pedro Menendez de Aviles, Spain's greatest admiral at this time. He's not a gold seeker. He's not here to plant a flag and hope for the best. He's here with one clear mission: secure Florida and remove the nearby French threat. Just a year earlier, a group of French Huguenots, French Calvinists as mentioned earlier, founded Fort Caroline near today's Jacksonville. France is trying to carve out its own foothold in Spain's claimed territory. And on September 8th, 1565, de Aviles establishes a settlement named for the day his fleet first spotted land, St. Augustine. But he barely had time to unpack before the real fight began. Menendez responds with brutal clarity. He marches north through a hurricane, surprises the French, captures the fort, and executes most of the men. Women and children, as well as Catholics, are spared. When a second group of French sailors shipwrecks nearby and surrenders, Menendez has them executed too, near a place now ominously called Matanzas, meaning slaughters. A later story claims that he posted a sign near the hanged French Protestants reading, "I do this not as to Frenchmen, but as to Lutherans." In other words, this is religion, not politics. Whether that sign truly existed or not, the message was clear. Florida belongs to Spain and will remain Catholic. Now that the French are gone, Spain builds out a long-term plan. St. Augustine becomes the capital of Spanish Florida, the anchor in a chain of missions running north and west along the Camino Real, or the Royal Road, the first long-distance road system in what is now the United States. Missions stretch inland across the Appalachian territory towards modern Tallahassee. Others expand west from there towards Pensacola. For decades, these missions support diplomacy, trade, and religious conversion throughout the region. But the frontier remains dangerous. Disease, warfare, and English-backed tribal attacks eventually destroy most of the mission system by the early 1700s. Before this, Spain was also faced with pressure from its greatest maritime enemy, England. In 1586, just before attacking the Spanish Armada, Sir Francis Drake storms into Augustine with a fleet. He burns the entire settlement to the ground, Wooden forts offer no protection. Spain gets the message. If St. Augustine will survive, it must be rebuilt in stone. And thus begins the construction of Castillo de San Marcos, a massive fortress built from coquina, a local limestone filled with ancient shells. Rather than shattering under cannon fire, coquina absorbs the impact like a sponge. Completed much later in 1695, the Castillo will never fall in battle, not once, and it remains standing today. By the early 1600s, Spain knows that England is building a colony in Virginia. Jamestown is a tiny, weak, starving little settlement, and it's in constant danger. Spanish scouting ships from St. Augustine sail north to locate the settlement and assess whether it should be wiped out before it takes root. But when Captain Samuel Argall arrives in 1609, he chases off the Spanish ships before they can discover how desperate Jamestown really is at this time. Had he found it during the starving time, early American history might look very different. But Spain is stretched thin, running a global empire and wars in Europe. The chance passes, and Jamestown survives.
So succeeding Elizabeth was James I of England, sixth of Scotland. Following her death at the hands of both her age and an illness, which we also don't know. With James, we have yet another Protestant ruler that entered the religious battle of Protestant expansionism versus Catholic expansionism at a young age, too. Just like his predecessor Elizabeth, it became a part of his personal identity. So we're seeing a theme here with the English nobility. At the Kirklefield House in Scotland, Henry Stuart Lord Darnley was assassinated through an ambush. Henry was James' father. Using a gunpowder cache and strangulation to finish the job, he was highly suspected to have been murdered by the Catholic nobility of Scotland, or at least that's what Henry's family and supporters believed vehemently at the time. It's highly likely that that was indeed the case, although we don't know for sure, and that the Catholic Mary, Queen of the Scots, was at least either involved or complicit, blowing him up. So Mary was an extremely devout Catholic, by the way. So in other words, a young James was conditioned to believe that Catholic, quote unquote, terrorist cells, as you could call them from his perspective, were willing and able to murder Protestant monarchy at will. So shortly after his father is killed, James's mother was also threatened and politically persecuted by Protestant forces. This is Protestant forces doing this to him this time. She was forcefully abdicated from the throne. She was imprisoned by Elizabeth in 1568, the Protestant Queen of England, who we just went over. She was kept in English prisons for 19 years until Elizabeth executed her. So, seeing this abuse and this conflict, James was influenced. But what he settled on is the notion that the only way to maintain political and religious solidarity and peace in England and among the Scots as well was to adhere to a Protestant monarch. It's interesting that he came to this conclusion after both of those occurrences, but he wanted total Protestant hegemony within the crown. The real influence behind James, really, though, was during his adolescence. He was mentored by Protestants. He even saw his mother as partially at fault for her own execution. He saw her as a Catholic interloper in some ways. He saw Catholicism itself as a threat to England as a result, that it endangered the monarchy. So he wouldn't even blame Protestantism for his own mother's death, even though it was a Protestant integralist monarch that killed her. So George Buchanan, which is a Calvinist thinker, was one of his mentors. James was also a protege of John Knox's guys. John Knox was a Presbyterian Reformationist. He was weak. He was agoraphobic. He was a rather isolated kid. He was deliberately kept contained, shrouded from any Catholic influence. He was indoctrinated with Protestant education to ensure his survival as a future monarch. His identity as a person, as an upcoming king, just like Elizabeth, was tied with Protestantism and its success. The result of this conditioning was that he formed a worldview in which the only way forward for England was for the throne to be occupied by a moderate Protestant. So he intended to aggregate all of the Protestant sects. He was king of Scotland from 1567 to 1625 and king of England as well from 1603, right when Elizabeth dies, until 1625, the same year. Just like Elizabeth, James's life was also threatened by the Catholics, as it went on. The Spanish Blanks Affair was the first of several Catholic plots. In 1592, to overthrow the Scottish Protestant monarchy using Philip II's army. Major Scottish earls, who were being directed by George Douglas, signed off on blank letters, which were to be filled with terms of invasion from Spain, but the plot was foiled because George Kerr, one of the co-conspirators, the couriers, was arrested and they found him with the papers. So James saw Protestantism as destined for a global empire. Similar to Catholicism at the hands of the Spanish, his primary colonial achievement was obviously the founding of Jamestown. Jamestown was unique, by the way, in that it was intended to be an ideological settlement as well as a physical one. It was almost akin to the global battle ideologically between the Soviet Union's communism and the United States' Western democratic capitalism. That's sort of the same thing that was going on with the English and Spanish in terms of the layout, not the ideology. The English colonies were imperative in James's mind. He wanted to prevent Catholic Spain from dominating the New World. He constantly said this. He insisted that colonization of the Americas was the way that the English were able to spread Protestantism and to civilize the natives.
Yeah, that I'm actually going to cover that and explain what England said it was doing religiously with Jamestown. I'm going over the religious motives section of this podcast. And first, in the 1500s and the early 1600s, religion isn't treated just as a private preference, it's an identity, it's a legitimacy, it's about social order. And rulers see themselves as responsible before God for the spiritual condition of their realm. So when England talks about planting colonies, it wraps the project in religious languages. And you see that in the first Virginia Charter of 1606, which frames colonization in terms of advancing Christianity among the people who are not Christian. So on the ground, there are plenty of colonists who are thinking about survival and profit and opportunity, but the key is that religion functions like legitimacy and moral cover. And it sells that project at home and it frames England's expansion as righteous, especially against Spain. And because England is entering an Atlantic world where Spain and Portugal have already acted like a papal world division and they already have the legal title, England needs language that sounds bigger than just we want to compete or we want that Spanish gold. Religion gives that moral justification. So the official pitch for Jamestown is a Christian mission, national destiny, and Protestant identity. Now, I want to go over also how England increasingly sees itself as a Protestant power competing with the Catholic Spain, which we've already went over. So I'm going to just go over it briefly. Virginia is framed as spreading Christianity full stop with mission language. Countering Spain is also with religious packaging, and it's framed as preventing a Catholic monopoly in the New World. You see this with Richard Hakluyt, who basically argues that planting colonies advances the gospel and weakens Spain. So it's piety and strategy kind of braided together, and they use a lot of Black legend material, which I explained earlier. Whether the moral narrative is fair or not, the point is that religion becomes weaponized story in the competition of states. Now, on to theology, because a lot of people get sloppy here and a lot of people have misunderstandings. I want to clear up misunderstandings. Today, people often use Calvinism like it means predestination, and Calvinists do believe in predestination. But historically, Calvinism is best understood as a reformed branch of Protestantism. That means Protestants who are not Lutheran. Now, Martin Luther's followers, they were called Lutheran as an insult at first, and they adopted that title. Now you have the Lutheran denomination. John Calvin's followers were called the same, but there was no Calvinist denomination that formed. It's basically just a theology that goes across different denominations. You have the Huguenots, and the theology of John Calvin very strongly influenced the Church of England, which is going into Protestant ideas. In the Protestant world, you basically have four major families. You have Lutheranism, rooted in the ideas of Martin Luther. You have Reformed Calvinists, which is based on the entire Reformed movement, including Martin Luther, but also mainly John Calvin, Zwingli, who started Presbyterianism in Scotland, which is the Church of Scotland, and others. And then you had radical reformers like Anabaptists, who are now Amish, who were outside of both the Protestant Reformation and Catholicism and the Church of England, but they were not pilgrims, and I'll go over that. But there's something important. Reformed Protestants, Calvinists were not anti-Luther. In fact, Martin Luther and John Calvin vibed well together, and Calvinists admire Luther, and they have him in their pantheon of, not pantheon, but as in their list of reformers that they admire the theology of. But they differ with Lutherans on the Eucharist, because Catholics believe the bread and wine is physically Jesus. Lutherans believe that there's a real presence in the bread and wine. Calvinists believe that there's a spiritual presence in of Jesus in the wine, not physical, not real. So it's not just kind of autistic, it really actually shapes the how the church life goes, because church life at that period was centered around the Eucharist. That's why people went to church. Predestination does matter too, but at the cultural level, the effect is that Reformed tradition tends to produce communities that are focused on Bible preaching and education and discipline in a society that's accountable to God. And that's the bridge to Puritanism. Now, what is a Puritan? Puritan is an academic label. No one called themselves Puritan or was called Puritan in that time period. People, historians like myself, use that word to refer to people who are members of the Church of England that had Protestant beliefs. That's it. Because normally, when the Church of England broke off, like I explained, they did not accept Protestant beliefs at first. So the Puritans wanted to bring Protestant beliefs into the Church of England. They wanted to purify it of paganism, Roman Catholicism. They didn't want it just to be a political break with Rome, and they were mainly Calvinist in theology. They adopted Calvinism and Reformed theology. But Puritans were not just one unified denomination. They considered themselves loyal English Christians. So they're just Christians. So, but for the sense of this series, we're going to call them Puritans because we're analyzing history. They wanted more preaching and Bible teaching. They wanted less ceremony and ritual. They wanted stricter discipline and Sabbath observance. They were hostile to bishops, depending on how far they went. Now, the Pilgrims are basically Puritans who crossed a line. They concluded that the Church of England was beyond reform, and they wanted to separate congregations outside of it. Theologically, they're the same as Puritans, but in practice, they did not want to reform the Church of England. They wanted to separate and build their own church, which is where we get the Plymouth Rock settlement. And that's separatism. Pilgrims were separatists. Puritans were just English Christians with a Protestant belief. So, because separatism wasn't just harmless at that time, it was illegal. That's why the Pilgrims left for the United States, where we get Thanksgiving. And then Plymouth becomes colonization and a covenant community. It's not golden glory with a Bible sticker, but it's strictly a religious mission to set up a Calvinist theocracy. It matters because Jamestown and Plymouth are two separate religious expressions. Jamestown is launched by, again, we can't say Puritans because we can't really define who's Puritan at that time period, but Anglicans under King James, and it's named after King James, and it's Jamestown. It's not a separate project. It's a Church of England official English project operating under Crown authority. And Plymouth is a separatist religious migration, people leaving because they view England's church settlement as compromised by Rome. So, simple takeaway is Jamestown, religion as justification, national strategy, commerce, anti-Spain. Plymouth is religion, dissent, self-government, and covenant community survival. And both are religiously inflected in different ways.
Thank you, and we'll definitely get into those colonies more in the next episode, which Arval will talk about. But I just want to wrap up all of that. So obviously, that was a huge scope of history, all the way from classical antiquity to right as the very cusp of the growing of American civilization as we would know it, not civilization in the Americas, but American civilization. So we've covered. This is the Europe of the Reformation, the Europe of these monarchs we have discussed, the Europe of technological innovation and these explorers and these competing kingdoms and consolidating power structures. This is the Europe from which the American nucleus is split off from and then cast into the New World, where it will then take root and grow. And it's important to realize now at this time, the Anglo-Saxons, which would form the core of the American ethnos, are not a monolithic power. They are not even a primary power. They will not be for over 100 years. America's rise, even if destined and ordained, as some may believe, was likewise paid for in blood and toil. And we will follow the journey of these intrepid settlers in episodes to come. But right now, we are entering a period where it's a Cold War of sorts, of colonization, of changing power dynamics, as well as the formal introduction of more of the Indian nations in war and diplomacy as we follow the stories of these settlers. Arval, if you'd like to play us out.
Yeah, wow. I really enjoyed this episode. I can't review this material enough for my own sake to really internalize it. And we kind of have a responsibility to internalize it. I also appreciate the audience being with us and doing this as a collaborative endeavor and being involved, as opposed to just reading textbooks and Wikipedia and whatnot on your own, which is not so fun. So this is keeping it engaging. We might have reason to kind of backtrack and cover some more about James or more about some of these issues that we touched upon today, but that'll be left to future episodes. And as I said at the beginning, future episodes will be a lot more condensed in their topics and more intensive on specific periods. So we'll be diving into the early English colonial period next time. And yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in.